Hello and thank you for joining for today's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Whistling Hunger. This is a cryptid horror story about the Peuchén. This shape-shifting entity is primarily known for its ability to change form at will, often appearing as a gigantic, flying snake or a serpent-like creature. In this story, a small team of ecological surveyors arrives in the remote forests of the Los Lagos region of Chile to document rare flora. Among them is Elias, a skeptic and academic who views local Mapuche warnings about the whistling wind as colorful folklore. He ignores the advice of the local guide, a soft-spoken woman named Sofia, who insists they avoid the valley of the Peuchén during the lunar transition. The second story today is called The Threshold of Mashu. This is a cryptid horror story about the Girtablilu. They are desert-dwelling guardians with the upper bodies of muscular humanoids and the lower bodies of massive scorpions. They are most often found defending ancient temples and religious artifacts with zealous fervor. In this story, a team of 6 elite recovery specialists, mercenaries hired by a private archaeological firm, are dropped into a remote, uncharted depression in the Rub al Khali desert. Their goal: retrieve a series of obsidian tablets from a temple that shouldn't exist. They aren't looking for gold, they are looking for a frequency, a rumored cosmic vibration mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Whistling Hunger. The first thing we noticed wasn't the blood, but the silence. The kind of silence that happens when every bird in the forest decides to hold its breath at the exact same time. A collective suspension of avian respiration that creates a vacuum in the auditory spectrum, so complete that it seems to generate its own pressure. Pressing against the eardrums with a physical force that makes the world feel smaller, tighter, as if the atmosphere itself has contracted to exclude every frequency above and below the threshold of human perception. Elias Correa felt it before he heard it, or rather he heard the absence of it, the subtraction of the normal woodland symphony that had accompanied their 3-day trek through the temperate rainforests of Chile's Los Lagos region. The biological orchestra, the trills of the Chukau tapaculo, the harsh cries of the crested caracara, the endless insectal drone of cicadas and beetles, and the 10,000 other species of arthropod that turned the forest into a living, resonating chamber, had simply ceased. Not gradually, not in the tapering diminuendo of a normal dusk chorus, but instantaneously, as if someone had reached into the soundscape and cut the power, throwing the entire ecosystem into a darkness more profound than any night could achieve. Elias stopped walking, his hand instinctively raising to halt the column of ecological surveyors behind him, and he stood motionless in the middle of the trail, his breath held, his ears straining to detect the faintest whisper of the normal world returning. But there was nothing, only the silence. Only the weight of a million creatures simultaneously deciding that breathing, singing, living out loud was suddenly too dangerous to continue. "What is it?" Sofia Vargas asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she too had been infected by the forest's muteness, as if speaking at normal volume would constitute a violation of some newly imposed natural law. She was the local guide, a Mapuche woman in her early 30s whose connection to the land was not the romanticized spirituality of tourist brochures, but a practical, inherited knowledge of the forest's moods and warnings, a literacy of place that Elias had dismissed as colorful folklore during their initial briefing in Puerto Montt. Elias was the lead botanist on the expedition, a tenure-track academic from the University of Concepcion, whose specialty was the documentation of rare and endangered flora in the Valdivian temperate rainforests, and he had built his career on the rigorous application of scientific methodology to ecological systems. He did not believe in spirits. He did not believe in curses. He believed in data, in observation, in the reproducible patterns of natural processes that could be measured, quantified, and published in peer-reviewed journals. Sofia's warnings about avoiding the valley of the Peuchen during the lunar transition had struck him as quaint superstition, the kind of indigenous narrative that anthropologists found charming, but that serious biologists could safely ignore. He had smiled politely when she spoke of the whistling wind that was not wind, of the creature that could wear the skins of animals, of the paralysis that struck those who met its gaze. He had filed her warnings in the same mental category as stories of the Loch Ness Monster and the Chupacabra. Entertaining, culturally significant, but biologically impossible. Probably a predator, Elias said now, his voice returning to its normal register with a deliberate effort that he intended as a demonstration of rational calm. A puma, maybe, or a family of foxes. The birds always go quiet when there's a large carnivore in the area. It's a standard fear response. He turned to look at the rest of the team, his expression projecting the confidence of a man who had explained this phenomenon 100 times before in undergraduate lectures. There were 4 other members of the expedition besides himself and Sofia. Dr. Renata Fuentes, a mycologist from Santiago whose passion for rare fungi bordered on the obsessive. Tomás Aguilar, a graduate student in forestry whose muscular build and easy smile masked a mind that was sharper than his casual demeanor suggested. Carla Mendez, a photographer and documentarian whose presence was funded by a National Geographic grant. And Dr. Gregory "Greg" Whitfield, an American entomologist whose decades of fieldwork in tropical ecosystems had left him with a phlegmatic temperament that nothing seemed to disturb. They were a small team, lightly equipped, carrying only the essentials for a 2-week survey of the remote valleys where the rare alerce trees grew in cathedral-like profusion, where the understory was a jungle of ferns and mosses and epiphytes that had never been properly catalogued. They were not prepared for predators, not in any serious sense. They carried no weapons beyond a single hunting knife and the bear spray that Greg insisted on keeping clipped to his belt, a concession to North American sensibilities that seemed absurd in the context of Chilean wildlife. Sofia did not look reassured by Elias' explanation. Her dark eyes, which seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, scanned the forest canopy with an intensity that suggested she was reading something in the architecture of the branches, something in the angle of the leaves, something in the quality of the shadows that fell in patterns too regular to be random. "A puma does not make the silence," she said, the words emerging with the careful precision of someone speaking a second language that she had mastered but would never fully claim as her own. "The birds do not hold their breath for a puma. They fly, they call warnings, they move away. This silence," she paused, her head tilting in a gesture that reminded Elias of a deer catching a scent on the wind, a motion so instinctive and animal that it sent an unexpected chill down his spine. "This silence is respect. This silence is fear. The forest is not hiding from something that walks. It is hiding from something that hunts in ways the birds do not understand." Elias opened his mouth to respond with another rational explanation, another comforting invocation of predator-prey dynamics and acoustic ecology, but the words died in his throat. Because in that moment, as if summoned by Sofia's description, he saw the first sign that something was genuinely, irrefutably wrong. It was a butterfly, a simple monarch butterfly, Danaus plexippus, a species common enough that Elias had seen hundreds of them in the course of his fieldwork. But this one was not flying. It was not resting on a leaf or feeding on nectar. It was suspended in midair, approximately at the level of Elias' chest, its wings open and motionless, frozen in the exact posture of flight but utterly immobile, as if it had been captured in amber despite the absence of any resinous prison. It hung there, a living statue, a biological impossibility that violated every principle of insect physiology and aerodynamics that Elias understood. He stared at it, his scientific mind scrambling for explanations. A sudden downdraft, a microclimate anomaly, a neurological seizure that had locked the insect's wing muscles in mid-contraction. But none of them accounted for the absolute stillness, the utter suspension of movement that seemed to extend beyond the butterfly to the very air around it. "Don't touch it," Sofia said, her voice sharp with an urgency that made Elias' hand freeze halfway to the suspended insect. "Don't touch anything that is still. The stillness spreads." Elias withdrew his hand, not because he believed her, but because the tone of her voice triggered a primal alarm in his nervous system that overrode his intellectual curiosity. He stepped back, his boot coming down on a twig with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the perfect silence, and the butterfly fell. It simply dropped, as if the crack of the twig had broken whatever force had been holding it aloft, and it landed on the forest floor with a sound that was not the light flutter of an insect's landing, but the wet, heavy thud of something much larger, something dense and liquid and wrong. It lay there, wings finally folding, and Elias saw with dawning horror that it was not dead. It was alive, its antennae twitching, its legs moving in slow, deliberate motions, but it was moving as if underwater, as if the air had become a viscous medium that resisted every attempt at normal locomotion. The butterfly was trying to crawl away from them, its wings dragging behind it like broken sails, and its movements suggested not injury but something far more disturbing: escape. It was fleeing from them, or from something behind them, or from something that was present in the silence itself. "We need to move," Tomás said, his voice low and steady, the graduate student's composure finally cracking under the weight of the impossible. "Whatever this is, I don't want to be here when it stops being theoretical." The others nodded, even Greg, whose usual equanimity had evaporated in the face of the suspended butterfly and the suffocating silence. They began to walk, faster now, their boots crunching on the leaf litter with sounds that seemed amplified to the point of obscenity, each footfall a violation of the forest's imposed muteness. Elias took the lead, his map in hand, his compass needle spinning uselessly in a way that he attributed to magnetic anomalies in the volcanic rock beneath the soil, but that he suspected, in the growing paranoia of his fear, might be something else entirely. Sofia walked beside him, her eyes never leaving the tree line, her BODY Chinese letter a constant readiness that suggested she was prepared to run, to fight, to do whatever the forest required of her to survive the next few hours. They walked for what felt like hours but might have been only minutes. Time had become as unreliable as sound in the silent forest, until they emerged from the dense canopy into a clearing that had not been on their maps. It was a livestock pen, a rough corral constructed of lashed alerce branches and topped with barbed wire that had rusted to a color indistinguishable from the autumn leaves. Inside the pen were cattle, perhaps a dozen of them, standing in the mud and feces of their own confinement, with a posture so unnatural that Elias felt his stomach clench with a premonition of horror. The animals were not grazing, they were not lowing, they were not swatting flies with their tails or shifting their weight from hoof to hoof in the restless choreography of normal bovine behavior. They were standing perfectly still, each one facing the same direction, toward the western tree line, toward the deepening shadows of the forest interior, their eyes wide and glassy with an expression that Elias could only describe as rapt attention, as if they were watching a performance that was invisible to human senses. "Oh God," Renata whispered, her mycologist's fascination with the grotesque finally overwhelmed by the reality of what she was seeing. "What happened to them?" Elias approached the fence slowly, his scientific mind reasserting control over his fear, his training in zoological observation kicking in despite the circumstances. He noted the species, Bos taurus, dairy cattle, probably a local breed adapted to the humid conditions of the Los Lagos region. He noted the condition of the animals, healthy, well-fed, no visible signs of injury or disease. He noted the position of their ears, rotated forward in the posture of intense auditory focus, straining to detect something that the humans could not hear. And then he noted the wounds. Each animal had a single puncture mark in the jugular region, a precise, circular incision that had been made with a surgical exactitude that no predator could achieve. The wounds were not bleeding, not in the normal sense. Instead, they wept a clear, viscous fluid that resembled neither blood nor lymph but something else, something that glistened in the muted light with an iridescent quality that suggested biological activity at the molecular level. Viral paralysis, Elias said, the words emerging with a confidence he did not feel. Some kind of neurotoxin, maybe a spider bite or a snake, though I've never seen anything that could affect a whole herd simultaneously. He pulled out his field notebook, his hands trembling only slightly, and began to document the scene with the automatic reflexes of a trained observer. Single puncture wounds, jugular location, no defensive posturing, no signs of struggle. The animals appear conscious but immobile, pupils dilated, respiration shallow. It's almost like they've been sedated, but I don't know of any predator that employs tranquilization on this scale. Sofia had not approached the fence. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her body angled toward the forest, her expression unreadable. "It is not a virus," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "It is not a snake. It is the Peuchén. It has been here, it has fed, and now it watches them. It watches to see who will come to investigate. The cattle are the message. The silence is the message, and we are reading it too late." "Sofia, please," Elias said, turning to face her with an expression that mixed exasperation with genuine concern. "I respect your traditions, I really do, but we need to approach this scientifically. There is a rational explanation for what we're seeing. There always is. We just haven't found it yet." He gestured toward the cattle, toward the impossible stillness of their frozen forms. "These animals are in some kind of neurological state. Shock, maybe, or a toxin-induced paralysis. We need to collect samples, document the symptoms, contact the local authorities. This could be an outbreak of something new, something that could affect other livestock, maybe even humans. Our job is to understand what's happening, not to attribute it to mythological creatures." Sofia looked at him with an expression of such profound sadness that Elias felt his argument falter in his throat. "You think the Peuchén is a myth," she said. "I know it is real. Not because I have seen it, no one sees it and lives to describe it clearly, but because I have seen what it leaves behind. My grandmother saw this. My great-grandmother. Every woman in my family back to the time before the Spanish came has known the signs, the silence, the stillness. The cattle standing like statues, and the whistling." She paused, her head tilting again in that deer-like gesture, her eyes narrowing as she focused on something in the middle distance. "The whistling will come tonight, when the moon crosses, when the boundary is thin. It will come for us, Dr. Correa, not because we have done anything wrong, but because we are here, because we are alive, because we make noise and cast shadows and breathe air that the Peuchén considers its own." Elias wanted to argue. He wanted to invoke Occam's razor, the principle of parsimony, the entire edifice of Enlightenment rationalism that had been his intellectual home since childhood. But the cattle were there, standing in their impossible stillness, their glassy eyes fixed on the western tree line, their puncture wounds weeping that strange, iridescent fluid. And the silence was there, pressing against his eardrums like water pressure at depth. And the butterfly had been there, suspended in midair, frozen in a moment of flight that should not have been possible. The evidence was mounting, accumulating like sediment in a river, and Elias felt the foundations of his rationalism beginning to crack under the weight of phenomena that his scientific framework could not accommodate. They made camp on the eastern edge of the clearing, as far from the livestock pen as the terrain permitted, their tents arranged in a defensive circle that seemed pathetic in its inadequacy. Elias insisted on collecting samples from the cattle, saliva, blood, tissue scrapings, despite Sofia's warnings that disturbing the scene would attract attention. He worked quickly, his hands moving with the efficiency of long practice, his mind retreating into the comforting routines of methodology. even as his instincts screamed at him to run, to abandon the samples, to get as far from this place as possible before nightfall. The sun was already low in the sky, the long shadows of the Alerce trees stretching across the clearing like dark fingers reaching toward the frozen cattle, and Elias felt a sense of urgency that he could not fully explain. They needed to document, to sample, to understand. And then they needed to leave. Tomorrow, at first light, they would hike back to the trailhead, contact the authorities, report their findings. They would let the professionals handle whatever was happening here. They were scientists, not soldiers. They were observers, not participants. But the Peuchen, if it was real, if it existed in any form that corresponded to Sofia's warnings, did not seem to respect the boundaries between observation and participation. As the sun dipped below the western tree line and the forest began its transition into the blue half-light of dusk, the silence deepened. It did not break. It compressed, becoming denser, more viscous, more resistant to the intrusions of human sound. The team gathered around the campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange light, their voices low and hesitant, as if speaking at normal volume might invoke something they did not want to meet. They ate their prepackaged meals without appetite, their eyes constantly drifting to the tree line, to the darkness that seemed to be advancing not gradually but in discrete increments, as if the night were being poured into the clearing in measured doses. "The lunar transition begins in 2 hours, Sofia said, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "The moon will pass through its first quarter tonight. In my grandmother's stories, this is when the Peuchen is strongest, when it can wear the shapes of the animals it has taken, when it can whistle the songs of the birds it has silenced. We should not be here when the moon rises. We should be far away in a village, behind walls, surrounded by noise and light and the company of many people. The Peuchen does not like crowds. It does not like confusion. It hunts in the quiet places, the lonely places, the spaces between." "We can't hike in the dark," Greg said, his practical American sensibilities reasserting themselves. "The trail is treacherous enough in daylight. At night we'd break our necks. We'll leave at dawn, I promise. But for now we need to stay put, stay alert, and stay together." He patted the bear spray on his belt, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but that Elias found almost pitiful. What good was pepper spray against something that could paralyze a dozen cattle with a single puncture wound? What good was any human weapon against a creature that seemed to operate on principles that transcended the normal physics of predation? The sound began as the moon cleared the eastern ridge, a thin silver sliver that cast just enough light to transform the clearing into a landscape of black and silver, of shadows that moved with the wind and shadows that did not. At first, Elias thought it was a bird, some night-active species that he had not catalogued, some nocturnal vocalist that filled the acoustic niche left empty by the diurnal chorus. But the sound was wrong. It was high-pitched, yes, and rhythmic, but it did not follow the melodic patterns of any bird call that Elias recognized. It was a whistling, a piurut, a repetitive 2-note phrase that rose and fell with a mechanical precision that suggested intention rather than instinct. And it was moving, not stationary, not emanating from a fixed point in the forest, but circling, orbiting the clearing at a distance that seemed to decrease with each repetition, each loop bringing the sound closer to the firelight, closer to the tents, closer to the huddled forms of the surveyors. "Don't look toward the sound," Sofia said, her voice urgent, her hand gripping Elias' wrist with a strength that surprised him. "Don't follow it. Don't answer it. The Peuchen whistles to find you. It whistles to know where you are. Every time you turn toward the sound, it knows your position more clearly. Every time you answer, it learns your voice." "That's insane," Elias whispered, but he did not pull away from her grip, and he found that he was staring resolutely at the fire, his eyes locked on the dancing flames, refusing to follow the sound as it circled closer. The others had heard it too. Renata had gone pale, her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. Tamaz had stood up, his body tense, his eyes scanning the tree line with the desperate intensity of a man trying to see what should not be visible. Carla was fumbling with her camera, her hands shaking so badly that she dropped the lens cap into the dirt and made no move to retrieve it. Only Greg remained seated, his face impassive, but Elias noticed that the American's hand had moved to the bear spray and was gripping it with a white-knuckled intensity that belied his calm expression. The whistling continued, closer now, close enough that Elias could hear the texture of the sound, the subtle imperfections that marked it as not quite mechanical, not quite natural. It sounded like a human trying to imitate a bird, he realized, but failing in ways that were deeply unsettling. The pitch was slightly off, the rhythm slightly irregular, the timbre carrying harmonics that no avian syrinx could produce. It was the sound of something wearing a bird's voice like a poorly fitted costume, the sound of mimicry that had not quite mastered its model, and the effect was more terrifying than any predator's roar could have been, because it suggested intelligence. It suggested intention. It suggested a creature that understood the power of sound to manipulate, to lure, to confuse, and was deploying that understanding with a precision that was almost scientific in its methodology. "Someone's playing a trick," Tomas said, his voice too loud in the compressed silence, a desperate attempt to normalize the abnormal. "Local kids, maybe, or hunters trying to scare us off their territory. I'm going to check it out." He took a step toward the tree line, his hand reaching for the flashlight clipped to his belt, and Sofia lunged forward with a speed that seemed impossible, her body interposing itself between the graduate student and the darkness. "No," she hissed, the word exploding from her lips with a force that made Tomas freeze in his tracks. "You do not go toward the sound. You do not go toward the darkness. The Peuchén wants you to separate. It wants you to walk into the shadows where your friends cannot see you. That is how it hunts. That is how it has always hunted. Alone. In the dark, where no one can hear you scream." Tomas stared at her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Fear, anger, embarrassment, the toxic cocktail of a young man who has been publicly chastised in front of his peers. But he did not take another step. The whistling was too close now, circling the eastern edge of the clearing, and the sound had developed a new quality, a richness that suggested multiple sources, as if the creature had learned to throw its voice, to create the illusion of a chorus where there was only a single singer. Piurut, 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 piurut. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical, and Elias felt his head beginning to turn of its own volition, his ears straining to locate the exact source of the sound, his body leaning toward the darkness like a plant toward sunlight. "Elias?" Sofia's voice was sharp, a slap across his consciousness. "Look at me. Do not look at the trees. Do not listen with your ears. Listen with your fear. Your fear knows where it is. Your fear knows what it wants. Let the fear keep you alive." He looked at her, into her dark, endless eyes, and he saw there a reflection of something that was standing just beyond the firelight, something that the flames illuminated only at their edges, something whose shape was wrong in ways that his visual cortex refused to process. It was large, whatever it was, larger than a man, larger than the puma he had invoked as a rational explanation hours earlier. It stood on 4 legs, but the proportions were distorted, the body too long, the head too high, the silhouette suggesting an animal that had been stretched and compressed in the hands of a sculptor who had never seen the creature he was attempting to represent. And it was whistling. The sound was coming from it, not from its mouth. Elias could not see a mouth in the flickering light, but from somewhere in its chest, its throat, a vibration that emerged without the visible mechanics of normal vocalization. "What is that?" Carla whispered, her camera finally raised, her finger on the shutter button, but her hands shaking so violently that any image she captured would be a blur of panic. "What the hell is that thing?" The creature stepped into the firelight, and Elias felt his mind tilt on its axis. The rational world he had constructed over 40 years of conscious existence tilting with it, threatening to collapse into a pit of madness from which there would be no return. It was a pig. Or rather, it was wearing the shape of a pig, the bristled hide and tusked snout and cloven hooves of the wild boars that roamed these forests. But it was wrong. The eyes were too high on the head, positioned almost on the crown rather than the sides, giving it a binocular forward vision that no Swede possessed. The legs were too long, the joints bending in directions that suggested not mammalian anatomy but something else, something reptilian or avian. And beneath the skin, beneath the bristles and the mud and the approximation of porcine normalcy, there were movements. Subtle, rhythmic movements, as if something were coiling and uncoiling inside the body, something that was too large for the skin that contained it, something that was preparing to emerge. The pig thing opened its mouth. Not to oink, not to grunt, not to make any sound that a pig should make. It opened its mouth and it whistled, the piuroot emerging from a throat that should not have been capable of producing it. And as the sound washed over them, Elias felt his muscles begin to tighten. Not with fear, though fear was there, flooding his system with adrenaline, but with something else, something that operated below the level of conscious emotion, at the level of neuromuscular control. His legs stiffened, his arms locked against his sides, his jaw clenched until his teeth ground together with an audible crunch. He tried to move, to step back, to run, but his body was no longer responding to his commands, and he realized with a horror that transcended anything he had yet experienced that the paralysis that had struck the cattle was now striking him, that the Peuchen's gaze, those eyes, those impossibly high, forward-facing eyes, was locking his nervous system into a state of absolute rigidity. "Don't look at it," Sofia screamed, the words cutting through the paralysis with the violence of a breaking chain. "Close your eyes, blindfold yourselves, now." But Elias could not close his eyes. His eyelids were locked open, his gaze fixed on the creature that was even now beginning to change, the pigskin splitting along a seam that ran from snout to tail, the bristles parting like a curtain to reveal what lay beneath. And what lay beneath was worse than any pig, worse than any boar, worse than any creature that walked on 4 legs in the forests of Chile. It was a serpent, but not a serpent of any natural species. It was winged, the wings, leathery, bat-like, veined with a tracery that suggested both biology and something else, something that might have been circuitry or might have been magic, unfolding from the ruptured skin with a wet, tearing sound that would haunt Elias' dreams for the rest of his life. The serpent's body glistened in the firelight, not with scales but with a smooth, moist integument that seemed to generate its own faint luminescence, a sickly greenish glow that illuminated the faces of the frozen surveyors in shades of corpse-light and decay. The whistling stopped. In its place came a sound that Elias could only describe as breathing, but it was not the breathing of lungs. It was the breathing of something that had emerged from a shell, something that was tasting the air for the first time, something that was orienting itself in a world that had suddenly become much smaller and much more vulnerable. The winged serpent, the Peuchen, the thing that wore shapes like a child wore costumes, the predator that had farmed the silence of the forest for centuries, rose into the air with a motion that was simultaneously fluid and mechanical, its wings beating with a slow, powerful rhythm that generated a wind strong enough to make the campfire gutter and spark. And Elias, frozen in place, his eyes locked open, his body rigid as stone, watched it ascend into the night sky and realized that the real horror had not yet begun. The real horror was not the creature's appearance, or its wings, or its impossible biology. The real horror was that it was hunting them now, that it had revealed its true form, that it was no longer playing the game of whistling and waiting and watching from the shadows. The game was over. The hunt had begun, and they were blind, frozen, and alone in a forest that had already decided to hold its breath until every last one of them was silent. "Elias," Sofia whispered, her voice coming from somewhere to his left, and he realized with a jolt of desperate hope that she had not been paralyzed, that she was still mobile, still capable of action. "Listen to me. I am going to guide you. We are going to move. One step at a time. Do not look up. Do not open your eyes if you can close them. The paralysis passes if you break the gaze, but you must not look at it again. If you look at it again, you will be locked forever. Do you understand?" He could not answer. His jaw was still clenched, his vocal cords as rigid as the rest of his muscles. But he managed a blink, a tiny flutter of his eyelids that conveyed his comprehension, and he felt her hand close around his wrist with a grip that was his only connection to the world of the living. She pulled him, one agonizing step at a time, away from the firelight, away from the clearing, away from the ascending serpent that was even now beginning to circle overhead, its shadow passing over them like the wing of death itself. They moved into the trees, into the darkness, into the silence that was no longer empty but full of the sound of wings and the promise of a gaze that would lock them into eternity. The whistling resumed, but it was different now. It was above them, around them, inside them, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very air molecules that surrounded their frozen forms. Piurut, 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 Piurut. The Peuchen was calling them. The Peuchen was counting them. The Peuchen was preparing to feed. And in the darkness of the silent forest, Elias Correa, skeptic, rationalist, man of science, finally understood that Sofia had been right about everything, and that understanding had come far too late to save anyone. The paralysis did not pass gradually. It broke, like a fever spiking and then dropping, leaving Elias gasping and trembling in the undergrowth with a suddenness that made him wonder if he had imagined the whole episode. One moment he was rigid as stone, his muscles locked in a rictus of involuntary tension, his eyes fixed on a point in the canopy where the winged serpent had disappeared into the darkness between the alerce branches. The next moment, the tension evaporated. His joints unlocked with an audible popping of cartilage and sinew, and he collapsed to his knees in the ferns, vomiting into the leaf litter with a violence that emptied his stomach in seconds. Sofia was beside him, her hand still gripping his wrist, her own body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear, and she pulled him deeper into the shadows of a massive fallen trunk, pressing them both into the damp, moss-covered wood with a strength that suggested she was using her own terror as a weapon against the greater terror that circled above. "It wears off if you break the line of sight," she breathed, her lips almost touching his ear, her voice so soft it was more a vibration in the air than a sound. "But only for a few minutes. The effect accumulates. Each time it catches your gaze, the paralysis lasts longer. The third time you do not recover. You become like the cattle. You become the bait." She paused, her eyes scanning the canopy with a frantic intensity that made Elias' heart hammer against his ribs. "Where are the others?" Elias looked back toward the clearing, his vision blurred by tears and vomit and the residual effects of whatever neurological weapon the creature had deployed. He could see the fire, still guttering but diminished, its light casting a shrinking circle of orange against the silver of the moonlit forest. And he could see shapes within that circle, silhouettes that were not moving, that stood in the same rigid postures he had just escaped. Renata, Tomás, Carla, Greg. They were still there, frozen by the firelight, their bodies locked in attitudes of interrupted action. Renata with her hands raised as if to shield her face, Tomás with one foot forward in the aborted stride of his attempt to confront the creature. Carla with her camera raised to an eye that would never again blink, Greg with his hand on the bare spray that would never be deployed. They were statues of flesh and blood, biological monuments to the moment when the Piuchén had revealed itself, and their nervous systems had responded by shutting down, by converting consciousness into a prison of rigid meat. "They're trapped," Elias whispered, the words emerging as a rasp from his abused throat. "We have to help them." "We cannot help them if we are trapped too," Sofia said, her voice carrying the terrible pragmatism of survival. "The Piuchén does not kill immediately. It locks them, studies them, decides which one to take first. It is a connoisseur of fear. It wants them conscious. It wants them to feel what is coming." She pulled him lower, pressing his head against the moss, her own face buried in the crook of his shoulder. "We must stay low. We must stay blind. The creature hunts by sight more than sound. If it cannot see our eyes, if it cannot lock our gaze, it must use other methods. and those methods are slower. Elias wanted to argue, to insist that they charge back into the clearing and drag their companions to safety, to invoke the solidarity of human community against the predatory isolation of the monster. But his legs were still trembling, his coordination shot, his body betraying him with a weakness that was the physiological cost of the paralysis. He could barely stand, let alone carry another person. And the sound from above, the slow, rhythmic beating of wings that was not quite the sound of feathers and not quite the sound of leather, but something in between, reminded him that the Peuchen was still there, still circling, still searching for the two who had escaped its initial display. "What is it?" Elias asked, the question emerging from a place deeper than scientific curiosity, from the primal need to name a thing in order to reduce its power. Really, not the folklore, not the legends. What is it biologically? Sofia was silent for a long moment, her body tense against his, her breathing shallow and controlled. "It is old," she said finally. "Older than the trees, older than the mountains maybe. My people do not think of it as an animal, Dr. Correa. We think of it as a force. A hunger that wears shapes the way the wind wears shapes in the clouds. It has no true form. The pig was a costume. The serpent is a costume. Beneath them there is only the hunger. The need to lock, to feed, to consume the movement and the warmth and the life of other things." She turned her head slightly, her lips brushing his earlobe as she spoke. "But if you need a scientific framework, think of it as a parasite, not of blood or tissue, but of nervous systems. It feeds on the electrical activity of mammalian brains. The paralysis is not a side effect. It is the feeding mechanism. It locks the prey, immobilizes it, and then it drinks. Not through the jugular like a vampire, through the eyes, through the optic nerves, through the pathways that carry consciousness itself." Elias felt his stomach clench again, a dry heave that produced nothing but bile. The puncture wounds on the cattle, the glassy eyes, the iridescent fluid weeping from the jugular incisions. It was not blood that the creature was extracting. It was something else, something that flowed through the nervous system, something that could be accessed through the eyes by a predator that had evolved, or had been designed, or had simply always existed, to exploit the most vulnerable pathway of mammalian biology. The gaze, the meeting of eyes, the ancient human terror of being watched, of being seen, of being known by something that had no right to know you. "We need to get to the village," Sofia continued, her voice gaining a desperate urgency. "The village on the eastern slope. It is 6 kilometers from here. If we can reach it before dawn, if we can surround ourselves with people and noise and light, the Peuchen may not follow. It prefers isolated prey. It prefers the silence between heartbeats. In a crowd, its hunting becomes inefficient. Too many eyes to lock, too many nervous systems to process, too much chaos for its precision." "And the others?" Elias asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "We cannot carry them. We cannot save them, not now, not with the creature circling." Sofia's voice cracked, the first sign of emotional fragility she had displayed since the whistling began. "I am sorry, Elias, I am so sorry, but if we die trying to save them, there is no one to tell the world what happened here. There is no one to warn the next group. There is no one to keep the knowledge alive. My grandmother said that the Peuchen thrives on forgetfulness, that every time the stories die, every time the warnings are dismissed as superstition, the creature grows stronger, because no one is watching for it, no one is prepared." Elias closed his eyes, squeezing them shut until colored patterns exploded across his retinas, and he felt tears running down his cheeks, hot and shameful and useless. He thought of Renata's passion for rare fungi, of the way she would spend hours on her knees in the leaf litter, photographing slime molds with an artist's reverence for the grotesque. He thought of Tomás's ambition, his plan to complete his doctorate and take a teaching position in Valdivia, to marry his girlfriend and raise children in the house his grandfather had built. He thought of Carla's camera, still raised to her frozen eye, still recording whatever the lens could capture in the dying firelight. He thought of Greg's bear spray, the absurd North American precaution that had seemed so comical hours ago, and now seemed like the last pathetic gesture of a species that had brought pepper spray to a neurological gunfight. "Okay," he whispered. "We go, but we go blind. You said it hunts by sight. If we can't see it, it can't lock us." Sofia nodded, her face a pale blur in the moonlight that filtered through the canopy. "Blindfolded or looking down, the ground is safe. The ground does not have eyes. The ground cannot be locked." She reached into her pocket and produced a bandana, a square of dark cloth that she tied around her own eyes with practiced efficiency. Then she produced a second one, a spare she had carried for dust and sun protection, and pressed it into Elias' hand. "Tie it tight. Do not peek. The temptation will be overwhelming. The creature knows this. It will make sounds to trick you. It will whistle from directions that suggest safety, that suggest curiosity. But if you look, if you open your eyes for even a second, the game is over." Elias tied the blindfold, the world vanishing into a darkness that was almost comforting in its completeness. He felt Sofia take his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in a grip that was not romantic but purely functional, a human chain that would keep them connected as they navigated the forest without sight. "Follow my lead," she said. "I know these paths. I have walked them since I was a child. Trust the ground. Trust the sound of my footsteps. And if you hear the whistling getting closer, do not run. Running makes noise. Noise attracts attention. Attention leads to the gaze. Walk slowly. Walk quietly. Become part of the forest's silence." They began to move, a shuffling, tentative progress through the undergrowth that was agonizingly slow and yet terrifyingly exposed. Elias kept his head down, his chin pressed against his chest, his eyes fixed on the ground that passed beneath his boots in a blur of moonlit ferns and shadowed roots. He listened to Sofia's footsteps ahead of him, the soft crunch of her boots on leaf litter, the occasional whisper of a branch brushing her shoulder, and he tried to match his rhythm to hers, to become an extension of her movement rather than a separate entity that might attract the predator's attention. The forest around them was alive with sounds that he had never noticed before, the microacoustic landscape that existed beneath the threshold of normal perception, the creak of alerce branches in the wind, the drip of condensation from the canopy, the scuttle of insects in the leaf litter, the distant hoot of an owl that had somehow escaped the silence. Each sound was a potential threat, a potential clue to the creature's location, a potential warning that the Peuchen was near. And then the whistling resumed, not from above this time, but from ahead, from the direction they were walking, from somewhere in the path that Sofia had chosen for their escape. Piurut, 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 piurut. The rhythm was the same, the two-note phrase that had haunted the clearing, but there was a new quality to it now, a richness and a depth that suggested the creature was closer, much closer, perhaps only meters away in the darkness ahead. Elias felt his steps falter, his body wanting to freeze, to lock up in anticipation of the gaze that he could not see but could feel pressing against his blindfolded eyes like a physical weight. "Keep walking," Sofia whispered, her voice steady despite the terror that must have been coursing through her veins. "It is in front of us, but it does not know exactly where we are. The blindfold confuses its hunting. Without eye contact, it must rely on sound and movement. And we are making very little of either." She pulled him slightly to the left, guiding him around an obstacle he could not see, her hand squeezing his in a rhythmic pattern that communicated direction and reassurance. "Step up. Root. Good. Now down. Softly." They navigated the whistling, moving in a wide arc around the source of the sound, their feet finding paths that Sofia seemed to know by instinct, by the inherited memory of generations who had learned to move through this forest in all conditions, at all hours, with all manner of dangers present. The whistling moved with them, circling, always maintaining a distance that was close enough to terrify but not close enough to attack, and Elias understood that the creature was testing them, probing their defenses, searching for the moment when their discipline would break and they would look up, look around, expose their eyes to the locking gaze. "It is hurting us," Sofia said, the realization emerging in her voice with a new depth of fear. "It is not trying to kill us yet. It is trying to drive us somewhere, to a place where we will be easier to process, where the terrain favors its hunting." She paused, her grip tightening on his hand. "The village, it does not want us to reach the village. It wants us to go somewhere else. Somewhere." She trailed off, her body going rigid, and Elias felt the change in her posture through their linked hands. "Oh no, oh no, no, no." "What?" Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "What is it?" "The village," Sofia said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who has seen her worst fears confirmed. "It has already been there. I can smell it, the stillness, the paralysis. The Peuchen does not herd us away from the village. It herds us toward it, toward what it has already prepared." They emerged from the forest onto a slope that Elias recognized by the change in the air, by the openness that replaced the closeness of the canopy, by the smell of wood smoke and domestic animals that should have been comforting, but was now tainted with an undertone of wrongness. Sofia had stopped walking, had released his hand, and Elias heard her pull down her blindfold, heard the sharp intake of breath that told him whatever she was seeing was worse than anything they had yet encountered. He stood frozen, his own blindfold still in place, his hands trembling at his sides, afraid to remove it and afraid not to. "Elias," Sofia said, and her voice was hollow, empty, the voice of someone who has seen the end of hope. "You can look now. The creature is not here, it has finished here. It has moved on." He pulled down the blindfold, blinking in the moonlight that seemed unbearably bright after the darkness of the cloth, and he saw the village. Or rather, he saw what the village had become. It was a small settlement, perhaps 20 houses arranged along a single dirt road that wound down the slope toward a stream that glinted silver in the night. But the houses were dark, their windows empty of light, their doors standing open in postures of abandonment or invitation. And the road was full of people, standing, perfectly still, their bodies locked in the attitudes of interrupted lives. A woman with a bucket frozen at the level of her waist, a man with his hand on a gate that would never swing open, a child with one foot raised in mid-step, a dog with its jaws open in a bark that would never be completed. They were the villagers, the families, the elders and children and animals that had populated this place for generations, and they were all paralyzed, all locked, all caught in the Peuchen's gaze and held there like specimens in a museum of living death. The silence was absolute, not the silence of the forest, which had at least contained the potential for sound, the promise that the birds might resume their singing when the danger passed. This was the silence of a place where sound had been eradicated, where every living thing had been locked into stillness, where the very air seemed to have solidified around the frozen forms of the victims. Elias walked among them, his movements automatic, his mind numb with the scale of the carnage. He touched the woman's arm, the one with the bucket, and her skin was warm, alive, but utterly rigid, the muscles locked in a contraction that felt like touching wood coated in a thin layer of flesh. He looked into her eyes, and they were open, aware, glistening with tears that had formed but not fallen, and he realized with a horror that transcended anything he had yet experienced that she was conscious. She was awake. She was trapped inside her own body, unable to move, unable to speak, unable even to close her eyes against the nightmare that surrounded her. "They are still alive," he whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Sofia, they are still alive." "Yes," Sofia said, her voice breaking. "That is the Peuchen's way. It does not kill quickly, it preserves, it stores. The paralysis is the first phase, the feeding comes later, much later. The creature takes its time, it savors. It consumes the fear as much as the nervous energy. These people, they will be like this for days, weeks maybe, until the creature returns to drink what is left." Elias felt his knees buckle, felt himself sinking to the ground in the middle of the dirt road, surrounded by the statues of the villagers, and he pressed his face into his hands and wept. The sobs emerged from a place so deep in his body that he did not recognize them as his own, a primal grief that was not just for the villagers or for his frozen companions back at the camp, but for the world itself, for the universe that could contain such a creature and still pretend to operate according to natural laws. The Peuchén was not a predator. It was a catastrophe. It was a force of nature that had somehow acquired intention, that wore shapes and whistled tunes and hunted with a methodology that suggested not instinct but design, not evolution but purpose. "We have to do something," he said when the weeping finally subsided, his voice thick with mucus and despair. "We can't just leave them. We can't just run." "We cannot save them," Sofia said, kneeling beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her touch the only warmth in a world that had become a mortuary. "Not with what we have, not with what we know, but there may be a way to stop it, to drive it back, to prevent it from doing this to other villages, other valleys, other people who do not know the stories and do not believe the warnings." She paused, her eyes scanning the frozen forms around them with an expression that mixed grief and determination. "I am a match, Dr. Correa. Or rather, I am in training to become one, a medicine woman, a keeper of the old knowledge. My grandmother taught me the rituals of banishment, the ceremonies that my people have used for centuries to push back the Peuchén when it grows too bold. But I am not fully trained. I do not have the experience, and the rituals require ingredients that I do not carry, herbs that grow only in specific places, sacred smoke that must be prepared under specific conditions." "Where do we find them?" Elias asked, the academic in him clinging to the possibility of action, of methodology, of a problem that could be solved with the right combination of knowledge and resources. "There is a plant," Sofia said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if she feared the frozen villagers might overhear. "The Cullen. It grows in the heart of the Peuchén's territory, in the places where it nests, where it returns between hunts to digest what it has consumed. To gather it, we would have to go into the depths of its hunting ground. We would have to walk blind. We would have to survive the whistling and the wearing of shapes and the locking of gazes. And even then, even if we gathered the herb and performed the ritual perfectly, there is no guarantee that it would work. The Peuchén is not a demon to be exorcised. It is not a spirit to be placated. It is a force that can be pushed back, temporarily, but never destroyed." Elias looked at her, at the young woman who had tried to warn them, who had carried the weight of ancestral knowledge into a world that had no room for it, who was now the only hope for a village that had been frozen in time by a predator it could not see coming. "Then we go," he said, the words emerging with a resolve that surprised him. "We find the herb, we perform the ritual, and if it doesn't work, we find another way. I'm not going to die in a forest without fighting back. I'm not going to become another statue in the Peuchén's collection." Sofia met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight with an intensity that suggested she was measuring him, testing his resolve, deciding whether he was worth the risk of trying to save. "The Peuchén will know we are coming," she said. "It always knows. It can smell intention. It can taste determination. The more we resist, the more interesting we become. And the more interesting we become, the more heads it will turn toward us." "Then let it turn," Elias said, standing up, his legs still trembling but his spine straight, his shoulders squared against the darkness that surrounded them. "Let it whistle. Let it wear its shapes. Let it try to lock our gaze. We're going to look that thing in the eye, figuratively speaking, and we're going to show it that humans are more than just nervous systems waiting to be harvested. We're going to show it that the stories don't die just because it kills the storytellers." Sofia stood with him, and for the first time since the silence had fallen over the forest, she smiled. It was a small smile, sad and weary and full of the knowledge of generations, but it was real. "You are learning," she said. "Slowly, but you are learning. The Peuchén does not fear weapons, it does not fear strength, but it fears memory, it fears the continuity of warning. It fears the stories that keep the next generation from walking into its hunting ground unprepared." She reached into her pack and produced a small pouch of dried herbs, a preparation that smelled of sage and copper and something else, something that made Elias' sinuses tingle with an almost electrical sensation. This is not the Peuchén. This is a lesser preparation, a masking agent. It will not hide us from the Piuchén, but it may confuse its senses, make us smell less like prey and more like something else. Predators, perhaps, or disease, something not worth the effort of hunting. She sprinkled the herbs over both of them, the dried leaves falling like snow on their shoulders and hair, and Elias felt his skin tingle where the powder touched, felt a warmth spreading through his muscles that was not natural but was not unpleasant either. It was the warmth of protection, however temporary, however uncertain, and he clung to it like a drowning man clings to driftwood. "We must go back into the forest," Sofia said, tying her blindfold back into place. "Back toward the clearing where your friends are frozen. The Peuchén grows in the deepest part of the Peuchén's territory, in a hollow near the stream that feeds the western valley. It is the creature's resting place, its nest, the place where it digests what it has consumed and prepares for the next hunt. To go there is to walk into the lion's den, but it is the only place where the herb grows in sufficient quantity to complete the ritual." Elias tied his own blindfold, the world vanishing once more into darkness, and he felt Sofia take his hand. "Lead on," he said, "and if I try to look up, if I try to remove the blindfold, hit me. Hard." "I will," Sofia promised, and there was no humor in her voice, only the terrible certainty of someone who understood that mercy in the face of the Peuchén was a form of suicide. They walked back into the forest, back toward the clearing, back toward the frozen forms of their companions and the circling terror of the winged serpent that waited in the dark. The whistling resumed as they crossed the tree line, closer now, more insistent, as if the creature had been waiting for their return, had known they would come back, had anticipated their desperate gambit with the patience of something that measured time not in hours but in centuries. Piurut, 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 piurut. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, above and below, inside and outside, a sonic net that tightened around them with each step. But they did not look up. They did not remove their blindfolds. They walked on, two blind humans in a forest of frozen statues, moving toward the heart of a hunger that had no name in any language but the one that Sofia carried in her blood, the ancient knowledge that might, just might, be enough to push back the darkness for one more generation. And in the silence between the whistles, in the heavy, counting silence of the paralyzed forest, Elias Correa finally understood that science and superstition were not opposites but partners, two ways of knowing that converged at the edges of the explainable, where the rational and the mythical held hands in the dark and waited for the dawn. The return to the clearing was not a journey measured in kilometers, but in psychological increments, each step a descent into a deeper stratum of fear, until Elias felt that he was no longer walking through a forest, but through the architecture of his own nightmares, the landscape of his anxiety rendered in ferns and roots, and the ever-present whistle that circled them like a vulture waiting for the dying to finally expire. Sofia led him with a confidence that was partly training and partly desperation, her feet finding paths that existed only in the inherited maps of her ancestors, her hand maintaining its grip on his, with a strength that suggested she was using him as an anchor as much as he was using her as a guide. The blindfold was both a prison and a protection, a darkness that prevented him from seeing the creature but also prevented him from knowing where they were, how close they were to the goal, how much farther they had to travel before they reached the hollow where the Peuchén grew. The terrain changed as they descended into the western valley, the familiar Alerce forest giving way to a different ecosystem, a place where the trees grew stunted and twisted, their branches curling back upon themselves in postures of arboreal agony, as if they had been trying to flee the ground for centuries and had only succeeded in tangling themselves into knots. The air grew thick with a humidity that was not natural, a moisture that seemed to emanate from the soil itself, rising in tendrils of steam that Elias could feel against his skin, even through the blindfold. The smell changed too, from the clean scent of pine and moss to something else, something that reminded Elias of the inside of a mouth, a warm, organic, slightly sweet odor that suggested the forest was not made of wood and leaf, but of flesh and saliva, that the ground beneath his feet was not soil but tongue. "We are close," Sofia whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their breathing and the distant, circling whistle of the Peuchén. "The hollow is ahead. I can smell the Peuchén. It grows in the places where the creature rests, feeding on the nutrients that the Peuchén excretes. It is a symbiont, a partner in the predation, but it is also the key to the banishment. The ritual requires the herb because the ritual uses the creature's own biology against it." "How?" Elias asked, his voice a rasp that emerged from a throat parched with fear and exertion. "The Peuchén contains a compound that disrupts the Peuchén's nervous system. Not kills, nothing kills it, but confuses, disorients, creates a kind of sensory blindness in the creature. When burned with salt and the ashes of sacred wood, the smoke forms a barrier that the Peuchén cannot penetrate. It is not a wall of matter but a wall of perception. The creature cannot perceive anything inside the smoke. It becomes invisible to the hunter, and a hunter that cannot see its prey loses interest quickly. It is not cruelty that drives it away. It is inconvenience. The ritual makes us too difficult to hunt." Elias processed this information with the part of his mind that was still capable of scientific analysis, the part that had not been entirely consumed by terror. It was chemical warfare, he realized, biological countermeasures. The Peuchén was a natural insecticide, a plant that had evolved to exploit the Peuchén's metabolic vulnerabilities, and the ritual was simply the delivery system. The mysticism was packaging. The science was real, and that realization gave him a foothold, however small, on the cliff face of hope. They reached the hollow, Sofia guiding them down a slope that Elias navigated by feel, his free hand brushing against the twisted roots and slick stones that formed the walls of the depression. The air here was even thicker, almost liquid, and Elias felt his lungs straining to extract oxygen from the viscous atmosphere. The whistling was very close now, no longer circling but hovering, maintaining a position somewhere above and behind them, and Elias knew with the certainty of prey that has learned to read its predator, that the Peuchén was watching them. It knew where they were. It had allowed them to reach this place. The question was why. "The herb," Sofia said, her voice urgent. "It grows on the eastern wall. I will guide your hands. We need to gather as much as we can. The ritual requires a large quantity, and we must be quick. The creature is curious. Curiosity leads to attention. Attention leads to the gaze." She released his hand and took his wrists, guiding them forward until his fingers touched the leaves of a plant that he could not see, but could feel with a clarity that suggested his other senses were compensating for his blindness. The leaves were broad and flat, slightly fuzzy, with a texture that reminded him of lamb's ear, but with a thickness that suggested succulence, water storage, adaptation to environments where moisture was scarce despite the surrounding humidity. The stems were woody at the base, herbaceous at the tips, and they broke with a crisp snap when he pulled them, releasing a scent that was sharp and medicinal, like eucalyptus crossed with camphor, a smell that immediately cleared his sinuses and made his eyes water behind the blindfold. "More," Sofia urged, her own hands rustling in the foliage beside him. "All you can carry, stuff it in your pockets, in your shirt. We will not have time to gather more if the ritual fails." They worked in the darkness of their blindfolds, the only light a diffuse silver that filtered through the cloth from the moon above, and Elias felt the weight of the herb accumulating against his chest and belly, pressing against his skin with a cool, damp insistence. The Peuchén's whistling had stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse than the sound, a void of acoustic expectation that made every rustle of leaf and snap of stem seem catastrophically loud. The creature was watching. It was waiting. It was deciding whether these two blind, helpless humans were interesting enough to process now, or whether they should be herded, driven, guided to a place where their paralysis would be more convenient, more efficient, more aesthetically pleasing to whatever predatory sensibility governed the wearing of shapes. "Enough," Sofia said finally, her voice tight with the strain of sustained vigilance. "We have enough. Now we must find a place to perform the ritual, a flat space, protected from the wind. The smoke must be allowed to accumulate. It must form a dense cloud, a blanket." She took his hand again and they moved, shuffling through the hollow, their feet finding the ground by trial and error, their progress agonizingly slow. Elias could feel the presence of the creature now, not as a sound or a sight, but as a pressure against his skin, a weight in the air that made his hair stand on end, and his teeth ache with a subsonic vibration that he could not hear but could feel in his bones. The Peuchen was close, very close, perhaps only meters away, hovering in the darkness above them, its wings beating with that slow, rhythmic pulse that displaced the air in waves he could sense against his face. "Here," Sofia said, stopping abruptly. "This is the place. Sit. Do not remove your blindfold. I will prepare the fire." Elias sat, his legs folding beneath him, his body sinking into a layer of leaf litter that was warm and damp and smelled of the same organic sweetness that permeated the hollow. He heard Sofia moving beside him, the rustle of her pack, the clink of stone on stone as she arranged a fire pit, the scrape of a match against a striker. The flare of the match was visible even through his blindfold, a sudden bloom of orange light that made him flinch and turn his head away. Then the sound of kindling catching, the crackle of flames, and the warmth of a small fire spreading across his exposed skin. "Salt," Sofia muttered, more to herself than to him. "The sacred ash, the Piuchén." He heard her working, the grinding of mortar and pestle, the sprinkling of powders, the tearing of leaves. "The ritual requires a chant, a calling of the true name, but I do not know if I have the right. I am not yet a match. My grandmother would know. My grandmother would have the authority. I am only—" Her voice broke, the mask of competence cracking to reveal the terrified young woman beneath. "I am only trying." "You know more than anyone else," Elias said, his voice steady despite his fear. "You are the only one who can do this. The only one who understands. Trust yourself. Trust what your grandmother taught you, and if it doesn't work, we'll find another way." "There is no other way," Sofia whispered. "Not here, not now." She began to chant. The words were in Mapudungun, the language of her people, and Elias did not understand them, but he felt their effect immediately. The syllables were not random. They were structured, rhythmic, carrying a cadence that seemed to resonate with the fire itself, making the flames dance in patterns that were not caused by wind. The smoke from the fire changed character, thickening, turning from gray to white to a dense, opaque cloud that smelled of the Piuchén and salt and something else, something ancient and powerful that made Elias' head swim and his vision blur even behind the blindfold. And then the Piuchén attacked, not with its gaze, the blindfold protected them from that, but with sound. It screamed, a high-pitched shriek that was nothing like the whistling, nothing like any sound that had emerged from the creature before. It was a sound of rage, of frustration, of a predator denied its prey by a defense it had not anticipated. The scream was accompanied by a physical assault, a wind that slammed into them with the force of a hurricane, extinguishing the fire, scattering the herbs, sending Elias tumbling backward across the leaf litter. He felt claws rake across his shoulder, not deep enough to kill but deep enough to tear fabric and skin, leaving trails of fire that blazed against the cool night air. "The fire," Sofia screamed. "It must stay lit. The smoke must not dissipate." Elias scrambled forward, his hands searching for the embers, for the scattered Piuchén, for anything that could reignite the ritual. He found a coal, still glowing, and he cupped it in his hands, ignoring the pain as it burned his palms, and he blew on it, coaxing it back to life with the desperate determination of a man who understood that extinction meant death. The ember caught, flared, and he fed it leaves and twigs, building the fire back to a blaze that was smaller than before but sufficient to ignite the herbs that Sofia was frantically gathering from the scattered remains of their preparation. The Peuchen screamed again, and this time Elias felt the displacement of air as it dove, its wings folding, its body dropping toward them like a stooping falcon. He threw himself over Sofia, shielding her with his body, his eyes squeezed shut behind the blindfold, his face pressed into the leaf litter. The creature passed over them, close enough that he felt the wind of its passage, the brush of its belly against his back, the wet smell of its breath, not the sulfur of the balor but something colder, something that smelled of caves and deep water and the mineral tang of blood that had been stored for too long. "Keep chanting," Elias shouted, his voice raw. "Don't stop." Sofia's voice resumed, trembling but determined, the Mapudungun syllables falling from her lips like stones into water, each one creating ripples in the air that Elias could feel against his skin. The smoke was building again, thicker now, the culin burning with a flame that was not orange but green, a phosphorescent glow that illuminated the hollow in shades of corpse-light and decay. The Peuchen circled, shrieking, its shadow passing over them again and again, but it did not strike. The smoke was working. The barrier was forming. But the creature was adapting. Elias heard the change in its flight pattern, the shift from the broad circles of frustration to a tighter, more focused orbit. It was studying them, analyzing the defense, searching for the weakness that all defenses possessed. And then he heard a new sound, a voice. Not the creature's whistle, not its scream, but a human voice, Tamaz's voice. "Elias, help me, I can move, I'm scared, I don't know where I am." The voice was coming from the edge of the hollow, from the darkness beyond the firelight, and it was so perfect, so exactly Tamaz, that Elias felt his heart lurch with a spasm of hope and despair. Tamaz was alive. Tamaz had broken free. Tamaz needed help. "Don't listen," Sofia shrieked, her chant breaking, her hand grabbing Elias' arm with a grip that would leave bruises. "It's not him, it's the Peuchen. It wears shapes. It mimics voices." "Elias, please." Tamaz again, closer now, the voice thick with tears and terror. "I can hear you. I can smell the smoke. I'm blindfolded too. I escaped when the creature went after you. Please, man, don't leave me out here." Elias' hand was already moving toward his blindfold, the instinct to help his friend overriding every warning, every lesson, every piece of knowledge that Sofia had imparted. His fingers touched the cloth, began to pull, and Sofia struck him. Not gently, not as a warning. She hit him with the full force of her fear and desperation, her fist connecting with his jaw in a blow that snapped his head back and sent him sprawling. "It is not Tamaz," she screamed, her voice raw with the violence of her own action. "Tamaz is frozen by the fire. I saw him. I saw all of them. The Peuchen has his voice. It has his memory. It is wearing him like a costume." The voice from the darkness changed. The terror and tears evaporated, replaced by a flat, empty tone that was somehow worse than any scream. "Sofia," it said, and now it was Renata's voice, calm and clinical and utterly wrong in its context. "Sofia, the ritual is wrong. You are using the wrong herbs. You are saying the wrong words. You are going to kill us all. Let me help you. Let me show you. Just look at me." "Don't look," Sofia shouted, but her voice was cracking, the strain of maintaining the chant while resisting the creature's psychological assault beginning to tell. "Don't listen. Cover your ears." Elias pressed his hands against his ears, the pressure painful but necessary, and he hummed a tune, any tune, a childhood song, a nursery rhyme, trying to drown out the voices that were not voices, the mimicry that was so perfect because it was not mimicry at all but extraction, the creature drinking the memories and voices of its victims and regurgitating them as lures. He hummed until his throat ached, until the sound of his own voice was louder than the false Tamaz and the false Renata, until the Peuchen's trickery was reduced to a background murmur that he could almost ignore. Sofia's chant resumed, stronger now, fueled by anger and grief and the absolute refusal to let the creature win. The smoke was thick, impenetrable, a wall of white-green vapor that surrounded them in a circle perhaps 3 meters in diameter. The Peuchen's shadow still passed overhead, but less frequently now, and the shrieks had diminished to a low, frustrated hissing that suggested the creature was reconsidering its investment of energy. The ritual was working. The barrier was holding. "The name," Sofia gasped between verses of the chant. "I need to speak the true name, the name of the forest, the name that the Peuchen fears because it is older than the creature, the name that belongs to the land itself." "What name?" Elias shouted, his hands still pressed against his ears, his voice barely audible above his own humming. "I don't know," Sofia cried, and for the first time she sounded defeated. "My grandmother never told me. She said I would know when the time came. She said the forest would whisper it to me." The Peuchen sensed the hesitation. The shadow returned closer, and this time Elias felt the brush of wind against his face, the displacement of air that accompanied the creature's descent. It was testing the barrier, probing the smoke for weaknesses, and Elias knew with terrible certainty that the barrier was not perfect, that the smoke was dissipating at the edges, that the ritual required a completion that Sofia could not provide. And then he remembered. Not a name from Sofia's grandmother, not a word in Mapudungun, but something else. Something that had emerged from his own scientific observation, from his own documentation of the forest, from the data he had collected in the days before the silence fell. The Alurse, the great trees. The ancient sentinels that had stood in this valley for 3,000 years, that had witnessed the Peuchen's arrival, that had survived every hunt and every freeze and every century of predation. The trees were older than the creature. The trees were older than the stories. The trees had a name, and the name was not just a label but a claim, a declaration of persistence, a statement of biological fact that predated mythology. "Fitzroy cupressores," Elias shouted, the Latin binomial emerging from his mouth with the force of a prayer, the scientific name of the Alurse tree ringing through the hollow like a bell. "Fitzroy cupressores, the Alurse, the tree that outlives empires, the wood that never rots, the forest that was here before the Peuchen and will be here after." Sofia's eyes widened behind her blindfold and she understood. Not the name her grandmother would have spoken, but a name nonetheless. A true name. A name that belonged to the land, that was written in the DNA of the trees, that was encoded in the chemistry of the soil. She took up the chant again, but now she wove the Latin into the Mapudungun, a hybrid invocation that was neither purely indigenous nor purely scientific but something new, something that belonged to this moment, this crisis, this desperate alliance between tradition and modernity. "Fitzroy cupressores," she cried, "guardian of the valley, witness of ages, protector of the living, drive back the hunger, drive back the wearing of shapes, drive back the whistling that is not wind." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Peuchen shrieked, a sound of absolute agony that was not physical pain but something deeper, something existential, as if the creature had been touched in a place that had no nerves but could still suffer. The shadow overhead convulsed, the wings beating erratically, and Elias felt the wind of the creature's distress buffet him like the backdraft of an explosion. The smoke from the Cullen fire surged, not dissipating but concentrating, forming a column that rose into the air like a spear, piercing the darkness where the Peuchen hovered. Again, Elias shouted, "Keep speaking." "Fitzroy cupressores," Sofia screamed, her voice breaking but her will unbroken. "You who have seen the Peuchen born, you who will see it die, claim this ground, claim these lives, deny the hunger." The creature fell. Not slowly, not gracefully, but like a stone dropped from a height, its wings folding, its body plummeting into the hollow with a crash that shook the ground and sent leaves and soil cascading over them. Elias felt the impact through his knees, a vibration that traveled up his spine and into his teeth, and he heard the creature thrashing in the leaf litter, its serpentine body coiling and uncoiling with a violence that suggested panic rather than attack. It was not dead. It would never die. But it was wounded, disoriented, driven back by a power it had not encountered in centuries, a power that came not from magic but from memory, from the accumulated weight of a forest that refused to forget. "The smoke," Sofia gasped. "Keep the smoke burning, we must drive it to the caves, to the deep places." She threw more culen onto the fire, and the flames flared green again, the smoke thickening, billowing outward in waves that pushed against the thrashing creature. The Peuchen shrieked once more, a sound of such profound loss and fury that Elias felt tears spring to his eyes, not for the creature, but for the victims it had consumed, for the voices it had stolen, for the lives it had frozen in its endless hunger. The creature gathered itself, its wings beating against the ground in a desperate attempt to achieve flight, and then it launched itself upward, not circling now but fleeing, its shadow passing over them one final time before it disappeared into the western tree line, heading toward the deep subterranean caves where it would nurse its wounds and plan its return. The silence that followed was not the oppressive silence of the Peuchen's hunting ground. It was the silence of aftermath, of exhaustion, of two survivors sitting in a hollow full of smoke and ashes, their bodies trembling with the release of adrenaline, their minds struggling to process the fact that they were still alive. Sofia removed her blindfold, her face streaked with tears and soot, her eyes red from smoke and strain. Elias removed his, blinking in the moonlight, and he saw the hollow for the first time, saw the scorched earth where the fire had burned, saw the churned leaf litter where the Peuchen had thrashed, saw the blood on his shoulder where the creature's claws had marked him. "It is gone," Sofia whispered, her voice hollow, empty, the voice of someone who has spent everything she had and has nothing left. "For now, not forever, never forever." "The others," Elias said, his voice rough, "the village." "The paralysis will break," Sofia said, her head nodding slowly, the words emerging with the careful precision of exhaustion. "When the Peuchen is driven back, its hold weakens. The villagers will wake. Your friends will wake. They will be confused, terrified, but they will be alive. The creature does not kill its locked prey when it is forced to retreat. It preserves them, stores them for the next hunt." They sat in the hollow for a long time, too tired to move, too traumatized to speak, watching the moon cross the sky and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient, indifferent patterns. The fire died to embers and Sofia made no move to rebuild it. The culen was gone, consumed by the ritual, and there was nothing left to burn. But the Peuchen did not return. The whistling did not resume. The silence was broken, occasionally, by the sounds of normal forest life, an owl's hoot, the rustle of a small mammal in the undergrowth, the distant cry of a night bird that had resumed its song now that the predator had been driven away. They walked back to the village at dawn, supporting each other, their bodies aching, their minds numb. The villagers were waking as they arrived, the paralysis breaking in waves as the sun rose, the frozen forms beginning to twitch and moan and collapse as their nervous systems rebooted from the Peuchen's hold. The woman with the bucket dropped it, the water spilling across the dirt road, and she looked at Elias with eyes that were still glazed with the memory of being trapped inside her own body. The man at the gate fell to his knees, vomiting, his body purging the residual toxins of the paralysis. The child who had been frozen mid-step began to cry, a high, piercing wail that was the most beautiful sound Elias had ever heard because it was the sound of life reasserting itself, of consciousness reclaiming its territory from the predator that had tried to steal it. They found the other surveyors at the clearing, similarly recovering, similarly confused, similarly traumatized. Tamaz was huddled by the ashes of the fire, his arms wrapped around his knees, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to emerge from a place beyond language. Renata was staring at her hands, flexing her fingers, confirming that they moved, that she was no longer a statue. Carla was curled in a ball, her camera clutched to her chest, her eyes wide and unblinking. Greg was the most functional, already standing, already scanning the tree line with the wary alertness of a man who understood that survival was temporary, that the danger had only retreated, not disappeared. They gathered what they could carry and hiked out, following the trail back to the trailhead, to the vehicle they had left parked at the edge of the national park, to the world of cell phones and hospitals and the mundane bureaucracy of explaining what had happened to authorities who would not believe them, who would attribute their trauma to altitude sickness or contaminated water or mass hysteria. They did not speak of the Peuchen to the park rangers. They did not mention the paralysis, the mimicry, the ritual. They said there had been an incident with a wild animal, a close encounter that had left them shaken but unharmed. They filed their reports. They collected their equipment. They returned to their respective cities, their respective lives, their respective attempts to forget what they had seen in the silent forest. But forgetting was not possible. For Elias, especially, the experience had carved channels in his psyche that could not be filled with the sediment of normal life. He returned to the University of Concepcion, to his office with its view of the campus gardens, to his lectures on temperate rainforest ecology and the documentation of endangered species. He tried to resume his research, to write the papers that would advance his career, to secure the grants that would fund future expeditions. But every time he entered a forest, every time he heard a bird call or the rustle of leaves in the wind, he felt the old fear resurface, the memory of the whistling that was not wind, of the gaze that locked, of the paralysis that had frozen his body and threatened to freeze his soul. He kept in touch with Sofia, at first through occasional emails, then through more frequent phone calls, finally through visits that became a lifeline for both of them. She had completed her training as a match, had taken her grandmother's place as a keeper of the old knowledge, and she traveled the villages of the Los Lagos region, teaching the warnings, keeping the stories alive, ensuring that the next generation would know the signs of the Peuchen's approach. She never blamed him for his initial skepticism. She understood that the world was full of people who needed to see the impossible before they would believe in it, and that some of them, like Elias, were worth the cost of the lesson. 2 months after their return, Elias was standing in a bus station in Puerto Montt, waiting for the overnight coach to Santiago, when he heard it. A faint, high-pitched sound that cut through the diesel fumes and the crowd noise and the electronic announcements of departures and arrivals. Piuchén, Piuchén. Piuchén, Piuchén. It was coming from the rafters of the bus station, from somewhere above the corrugated metal roof, and it was close enough that Elias could feel the old paralysis beginning to tingle in his muscles, the familiar lock of terror that he had thought he had left behind in the Western Hollow. He did not look up. He did not search for the source of the sound. He turned and walked out of the bus station, abandoning his ticket, his luggage, his plans, and he kept walking until he reached the waterfront, until the sound of the harbor drowned out the whistling, until he could breathe again without feeling the weight of the creature's gaze upon his back. Sofia found him there, hours later, sitting on a bench overlooking the Pacific, his body shaking with delayed shock. She sat beside him and took his hand, and they watched the sun set over the ocean in silence. "It was not the same one," she said finally, her voice soft, gentle, the voice of a healer speaking to a wounded patient. "The Peuchen we drove back was bound to the caves, to the forest. It would not follow you here, but there are others. The hunger is not one creature. It is many. They move. They find new hunting grounds. The one in the forest was driven back, but its hunger, the hunger simply found a new place to feed." Elias nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He understood now, with a finality that was almost peaceful, that the Peuchen was not a monster to be defeated but a condition to be managed, like a chronic disease, like an ecological imbalance that could be mitigated but never cured. The ritual had saved them. The ritual had saved the village, but the ritual had not destroyed the hunger. It had only moved it, displaced it, sent it seeking easier prey in places where the stories had died, where the warnings had been forgotten, where the people walked blindly into the silence because they did not know to be afraid. "What do we do?" he asked, the question that had no final answer. "We tell the stories," Sofia said. "We keep the warnings alive. We teach the children to recognize the silence, to fear the stillness, to run from the whistling that is not wind. And we prepare, because the Peuchén will return, not to us perhaps, but to someone somewhere. And when it does, there must be people who know what it is and how to fight it." They sat on the bench until the stars emerged, until the harbor lights reflected on the black water like the eyes of something watching from the depths. And in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the whistling resumed, not close enough to hunt them, but close enough to remind them that the hunger was never satisfied, that the forest was never truly safe, and that the silence they had broken in the hollow was only one silence among many, one pause in the endless, ravenous song of a creature that would outlive them all. Elias took Sofia's hand and squeezed it, and together they watched the darkness, two survivors bound by knowledge that the world did not want, guardians of a warning that the world was not ready to hear. And somewhere in the forests of the Los Lagos region, and somewhere in the rafters of a bus station, and somewhere in the spaces between the heartbeats of 1,000 frozen victims, the Piuchén continued to whistle, to wear its shapes, to hunt in the silence that it had made its own. The hunger never died, it only moved, and it was always listening. The Threshold of Mashu. The first thing we noticed wasn't the smell of sulfur or the size of the footprints. It was the way the silence felt heavy, as if the air itself was waiting for permission to vibrate. Sergeant Darius Cole stood at the edge of the depression, his military-issue boots sinking slightly into the sand that had been disturbed by their helicopter's rotor wash, and he felt the silence press against his eardrums with a physical weight that made him swallow reflexively. He had been a soldier for 20 years, had served in conflicts across 3 continents, had heard the absence of sound in deserts and jungles and frozen tundra, but he had never encountered a silence like this. It wasn't peaceful. It wasn't empty. It was expectant, loaded with potential, like the moment between the flash of lightning and the crash of thunder when the whole world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of destruction. Behind him, the rest of the team was disembarking from the chopper, their movements efficient and practiced despite the strangeness of their surroundings. There were 6 of them in total, elite recovery specialists hired by a private archaeological firm called Meridian Antiquities that operated in the shadowy spaces between legitimate research and corporate extraction. They weren't scientists, though some of them had scientific backgrounds. They weren't soldiers, though they carried weapons and knew how to use them. They were something else entirely, mercenaries of the forgotten, mercenaries of the lost, hired to venture into places that governments wouldn't sanction and academics wouldn't touch, to retrieve objects of value from sites that existed more in rumor than in official record. Their current mission had sounded, on paper, like so many others. Travel to a remote location in the Rub al Khali desert, locate a temple that satellite imagery suggested shouldn't exist, recover a series of obsidian tablets, and return them to Meridian's private collection before anyone else could claim them. But the tablets weren't the real prize, Cole knew. The real prize was the frequency that Meridian's researchers had identified in their analysis of satellite data and intercepted communications. Some combination of seismic readings, electromagnetic anomalies, and ancient texts had convinced Meridian's board that this site contained something far more valuable than carved stone, a cosmic vibration, a resonance mentioned in fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh that spoke of the gateway between the world of the living and the world of the gods. Cole didn't understand the science, if it even was science. He understood missions, objectives, extraction protocols. He understood that Meridian paid extremely well for discretion and success, and that failure in this line of work often meant disappearance rather than termination. The desert was very large and very empty and very good at keeping secrets. The team assembled around him, and Cole ran through a mental inventory of his people. There was himself, Darius Cole, former Army Ranger, team leader by virtue of experience, and the cold calculation that made him effective at planning operations where violence might be necessary. There was Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, the team's intelligence officer and linguist, a compact woman in her mid-30s who spoke 7 languages and could read 4 dead ones, whose file contained references to unconventional methods that Cole had learned not to question. There was Dr. Samuel Okonkwo, the team's lead scientist, a geophysicist who had left a promising academic career after a scandal involving unauthorized experiments on sacred sites in West Africa. There was Corporal Jax Morrison, the team's security specialist, a young man with a hot temper and a quicker trigger finger, whose enthusiasm for his work sometimes outpaced his judgment. There was Private First Class Elena Vasquez, the team's medic and demolitions expert, a quiet woman with scarred hands and a 1,000-yard stare that suggested she had seen things she never talked about. And there was the asset, as Meridian referred to him in the briefing documents, a man named Silas Vane, who claimed to be a sensory consultant and whose exact role in the operation remained frustratingly undefined. "Report," Cole said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence with an effort that made his throat feel raw. "No radio contact," Tanaka said, her eyes scanning the horizon through high-powered binoculars. "Satellite uplink is intermittent. We're getting bursts of data, but nothing sustained. It's like something is interfering with the signal." "Magnetic anomaly?" Cole asked, turning to Okonkwo. The geophysicist was frowning at his handheld scanner, his dark face creased with concentration. "Not exactly. The readings they're wrong. I'm getting electromagnetic fluctuations that don't correspond to any natural phenomenon I've ever encountered." "And the ground composition," he knelt, pressing his palm against the sand, and his frown deepened. "This isn't natural sediment. This is processed, manufactured. Someone or something has been engineering the geology of this area for thousands of years." "Engineering geology," Morrison laughed, the sound harsh and too loud in the oppressive silence. "Doc, you've been in the sun too long. Rocks don't get engineered." "These rocks do," Okonkwo said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Morrison's laughter die in his throat. "Trust me, Corporal. I've spent 15 years reading the language of stone, and these stones are speaking a dialect I've never heard before. They're saying go back. They're saying this place is not for you." "Stones don't talk," Morrison muttered, but his hand had drifted to the grip of his sidearm, and Cole noticed that his fingers were trembling slightly. "The silence," Vasquez said, her voice so soft that Cole almost missed it. She was standing slightly apart from the group, her medic's bag slung over one shoulder, her eyes fixed on the depression that opened before them like a wound in the earth. "Has anyone else noticed the silence?" They all had, but hearing it named aloud made it somehow more real, more threatening. Cole felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he turned to survey the depression that was their destination. It was massive, far larger than the satellite imagery had suggested, a bowl-shaped cavity in the desert floor that stretched for what looked like miles in every direction. The walls of the depression weren't sheer cliffs, but rather sloped gradients of dark stone that caught the harsh desert sunlight and reflected it back in shades of brown and red that seemed almost organic, almost like skin. And rising from the floor of the depression, visible even from their vantage point at the rim, were structures. Twin peaks, or rather what had once been twin peaks. As the team descended into the depression, their boots slipping on the loose scree that covered the slope, the true nature of the structures became increasingly apparent. They weren't mountains of rock. They weren't natural formations at all. They were petrified remains, colossal beyond any scale that Cole's mind could comfortably process, the desiccated corpses of something that had once been alive, or perhaps had never been alive in any conventional sense, twisted and mineralized over millennia, until they resembled geological features rather than biological ones. The mountains were ridged with what looked like fossilized vertebrae, their slopes covered in patterns that might have been scales or might have been some other form of integument, their peaks crowned with formations that suggested horns or antennae or sensory organs that had been calcified into strange, branching shapes. "My God," Okonkwo whispered, his scientific composure cracking. "These aren't mountains. These are remains. Something died here or was killed here, and its body was so massive that it became the landscape." "The twin mountains of Mashu," Tanaka said, her voice carrying a reverence that surprised Cole. "From the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gateway to the land of the gods guarded by scorpion men. I thought it was mythology. I thought it was metaphor." "Maybe it still is," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe these are just weird rock formations that happen to look like whatever." "No," Vane spoke for the first time, his voice low and resonant, carrying a timbre that seemed to vibrate in Cole's sternum. "These are not metaphor. These are not formation. These are body. Dead body of something that existed before human, before mammal, before life as you understand it, and we are standing in its grave." Cole turned to look at the sensory consultant, who had hung back from the group's advance and now stood at the edge of the depression's rim, his body silhouetted against the blazing sky. Vane was a tall man, thin to the point of emaciation, with pale skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and eyes that were so dark they appeared to be all pupil, black pools that gave nothing away. He dressed in loose, dark clothing that seemed designed to make him blend with shadows, and he moved with an economy of motion that suggested every gesture was calculated, every step precisely placed. Cole didn't like him. Cole didn't trust him. But Meridian had insisted on his inclusion, had hinted that Vane's particular sensitivities might be the difference between success and failure in an environment that defied conventional understanding. "You knew about this," Cole said, making it an accusation rather than a question. "You knew what we'd find here." "I knew possibilities," Vane replied, his black eyes fixed on the petrified remains below. "I did not know certainties. The world of the old gods is not a place of fixed coordinates and measurable distances. It shifts. It breathes. It responds to the presence of the living. What we find here today may not be what others would find tomorrow." "Cryptic bullshit," Morrison muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Vane turned his gaze on the young corporal, and Cole saw Morrison flinch as if struck. There was something in Vane's eyes, something that wasn't quite human, that seemed to look past the surface of Morrison's bravado and see the fear that pulsed beneath it. "The young warrior speaks boldly," Vane said, his voice almost gentle. "But his heart races at 120 beats per minute, and his palms are wet with sweat that has nothing to do with heat. He feels what the rest of you feel. He simply lacks the wisdom to name it." "Enough," Cole barked, stepping between Vane and Morrison. "We have a mission. We have objectives. We don't have time for philosophical debates about dead gods and petrified monsters. Dr. Okonkwo, I want a full geological survey of the site. Lieutenant Tanaka, I want those translations of the warning carvings as soon as you can manage. Morrison, establish a perimeter. Vasquez, prepare medical stations. Vane," he paused, uncertain how to assign a task to a man whose role remained undefined. "Vane, stay out of the way and advise if you sense anything that might threaten the team." "I sense many things," Vane said softly. "Most of them would threaten you if you understood them, but I will watch, I will wait, and I will speak when speaking becomes necessary." They made camp in the valley between the twin petrified remains, setting up tents and equipment in the shadow of structures that dwarfed anything Cole had ever encountered. The valley floor was covered in a fine, dark dust that Okonkwo identified as pulverized basalt, suggesting volcanic activity in the distant past, though the surrounding geology showed no evidence of volcanic formations. The dust got into everything: their clothes, their hair, their equipment, their lungs. And within hours, Cole found himself coughing up black phlegm that tasted of copper and something else, something mineral and old that made his tongue feel coated in metal. The warning carvings were visible even from the camp, etched into the basalt walls that formed the inner boundary of the valley. They weren't concentrated in a single location, but rather distributed in patterns that Tanaka described as almost algorithmic, repeating sequences of symbols and images that seemed to encode information rather than merely decorate the stone. She spent the afternoon photographing and sketching, her brow furrowed in concentration, occasionally muttering to herself in languages that Cole didn't recognize. "What do they say?" Cole asked, bringing her a canteen of water as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the petrified remains in shades of blood and gold. Tanaka accepted the canteen without looking up from her sketchpad. "They're complex, layered. The surface text is standard Mesopotamian, Akkadian cuneiform mostly, with some Sumerian loanwords. Standard protective curses, threats against desecrators, appeals to various gods to strike down the impious. But there's a secondary layer underneath, written in a script I don't recognize. It's older, much older, and it keeps repeating the same phrases over and over like a mantra or a programming loop." A programming loop. She finally looked up, and Cole was struck by how pale she had become, how dark the circles under her eyes. "That's what it feels like, Sarge. These carvings aren't just warnings. They're instructions, protocols. They're telling us how to behave if we want to survive entering the temple, and they're telling us what will happen if we don't." What will happen? The words translate roughly as the guardians do not sleep, the guardians do not hunger, the guardians serve the threshold, and the threshold must remain pure. Those who approach with unclean intent will be made clean. Those who approach with clean intent will be judged. Those who flee will be hunted. Those who stand will be tested. There is no escape from the gaze of the gate. "Standard intimidation tactics," Cole said, though his voice lacked the conviction he tried to project. "Ancient civilizations used to carve scary stories on their temples to keep superstitious locals away. Doesn't mean there's anything actually dangerous here." "Doesn't mean there isn't," Tanaka countered, her eyes returning to the carvings. "And these aren't scary stories, Sarge. These are precise technical specifications. They describe the guardians in detail, their size, their speed, their methods of detection and elimination. They describe the gaze as a weapon that operates on principles of soul resonance. They describe something called curation, which involves preserving intruders in a state of living death to serve as warning beacons for future trespassers. This isn't mythology. This is a user manual for a security system that was designed to operate for eternity." Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "You think the security system is still active?" "I think," Tanaka said carefully, "that we would be foolish to assume it's not." They set up watches through the night, rotating 2-hour shifts while the others tried to sleep in tents that seemed flimsy and inadequate against the backdrop of the petrified remains. Cole took the first watch, sitting on a folding stool with his rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness that pooled between the twin peaks. The stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way stretching across the sky in a band of light that seemed close enough to touch. But Cole found his attention drawn repeatedly to the ground, to the shadows at the base of the basalt walls, to the places where the darkness seemed thicker than it should have been. The silence continued, that heavy, expectant silence that had marked their arrival. But as the night deepened, Cole began to detect something beneath it, a subsonic vibration, almost below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was more like a pressure, a fluctuation in the air that made his eardrums ache and his sinuses throb. He pressed his fingers to his temples and found that the vibration was stronger there, as if it was traveling through his bones rather than his ears. "You're feeling it," Vane said, appearing from the darkness so silently that Cole nearly shot him. The sensory consultant settled onto the sand beside Cole's stool, his black eyes reflecting the starlight in a way that made them seem to glow. "The frequency, the cosmic vibration that Meridian seeks, it is not a sound, it is not energy, it is the heartbeat of the threshold itself, the pulse of the boundary between what is and what should not be." "You're saying this place is alive?" Cole asked, his hand still on his rifle. "I am saying that life and death are categories that apply poorly to what exists here. The threshold is not alive. It is aware. It watches. It waits. And when the conditions are met, it acts." "What conditions?" "The conditions of violation. The conditions of approach. The conditions that your team has already begun to fulfill simply by being here." Cole opened his mouth to demand clarification, but a sound from the darkness cut him off. Not the subsonic vibration, not the expectant silence, but something else. A clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, like the tapping of chitin against stone. It came from the direction of the temple entrance, from the space between the twin petrified peaks where the darkness seemed absolute, and it was accompanied by a smell that made Cole's nostrils flare and his stomach clench. It was the smell of a butcher's shop in summer, of meat and musk, and something else, something chemical and sharp that reminded him of the solvent his mother had used to clean her industrial sewing machine when he was a child. "Did you hear that?" Cole whispered, his hand tightening on his rifle. "I heard," Vane said, and for the first time Cole heard fear in the man's voice. Not panic, not terror, but a deep, resigned dread that spoke of knowledge too terrible to share. "The guardians stir. The threshold senses your presence, and the gaze of the gate is beginning to open." The clicking grew louder, closer, and Cole found himself rising from his stool without conscious decision, his body moving on instinct, muscle memory from 100 combat situations, overriding the rational part of his mind that was screaming that whatever was approaching was not something that could be fought with conventional weapons. He raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel into the darkness, and waited. The thing that emerged from between the petrified peaks was not human. It was not animal. It was not anything that Cole's mind had categories for, and he felt his grip on reality waver as his eyes tried to process what they were seeing. It was massive, 15 feet tall at least, maybe more, and it moved with a terrible, alien grace that suggested joints bending in directions that human anatomy couldn't accommodate. Its body was armored in plates of chitin that gleamed with an oily iridescence in the starlight, shades of brown and black and deep, bruised purple that shifted and changed as the creature moved. Its lower body was scorpion, massive segmented tail arching over its back, stinger glistening with a wetness that caught the light and seemed to glow from within. But its upper body was something else entirely. Torso of a man, but wrong. Too broad, too muscled, the proportions subtly distorted in ways that suggested strength beyond any human capacity. Arms that ended in massive pincers rather than hands, the chitin gleaming like polished obsidian. And the head was the worst part. It was humanoid almost, with features that suggested a face. But the eyes were multifaceted, compound, like an insect's, each facet reflecting a different fragment of the starlight in a constellation of tiny points that seemed to contain entire galaxies. The mouth was a seam of chitin that opened and closed with a clicking that matched the rhythm Cole had heard earlier, revealing rows of teeth that were too numerous, too sharp, too perfectly arranged for any natural predator. It was a Girtablilu, the scorpion man of Mesopotamian mythology, the guardian of the gates of the sun, the sentinel who stood at the threshold between the world of the living and the world of the divine. And it was standing less than 50 feet from Cole's position, its multifaceted eyes fixed on him, with an attention that felt like physical pressure against his skull. "Don't move," Vane whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't speak. Don't breathe if you can help it. The gaze of the gate is upon us, and any movement, any sound, any sign of intent will be interpreted as aggression." Cole held perfectly still, his rifle still raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. The Girtablilu watched him, its head tilting slowly to one side in a gesture that was almost curious. It didn't attack. It didn't charge. It simply stood there, its massive form blocking the entrance to whatever lay beyond the twin peaks, its eyes tracking Cole's position with a precision that suggested it could see him perfectly even in the absolute darkness. And then Cole realized something that made his blood run colder than the desert night. The creature wasn't looking at him. Not really. Its eyes were fixed on a point somewhere behind him, somewhere above him, as if it was examining something that existed in a dimension Cole couldn't perceive. It was looking through him, through all of them, seeing something in their souls that they couldn't see themselves. "It's judging us," Tanaka whispered. She had emerged from her tent without Cole noticing, her sketchpad clutched to her chest, her face pale as moonlight in the darkness. The texts were right. The Guardians don't just kill, they evaluate. They determine whether the intruder is worthy of passage or deserving of destruction. Worthy of passage to where? Morrison had appeared beside Cole, his own rifle raised, his voice tight with the effort of controlling his fear. What the hell is on the other side of those peaks that needs this kind of security? The frequency, Vane said softly. The cosmic vibration. The resonance that Meridian seeks. It is not an object to be retrieved. It is a state of being, a condition of existence. And the Girtablilu exists to ensure that only those who can survive that state are allowed to approach it. The creature shifted its weight, chitin clicking against stone, and the smell intensified. The butcher shop smell of meat and musk and chemical sharpness, combined now with something else, something that Cole's hindbrain identified before his conscious mind could process it. It was the smell of a hospital room where someone had died after a long illness, the smell of antiseptic failing to mask decay, the smell of a body that had been preserved beyond its natural span, kept alive by artificial means while the soul had already departed. "It's smelling us," Vasquez said, her voice flat and clinical. "It's scent marking, determining our biological signatures." "More than that," Okonkwo added. He too had emerged from his tent, his geophysical scanner forgotten in his hand, his eyes fixed on the Girtablilu with an expression of horrified fascination. "It's reading our electromagnetic fields, our auras, if you want to use that term. It's evaluating us on levels we don't have instruments to measure." The creature took a step forward and the ground trembled beneath its weight. Cole felt the vibration through his boots, through his legs, through his spine, a resonance that seemed to harmonize with the subsonic pulse he had felt earlier. The Girtablilu was massive, yes, but there was more to its presence than mere physical bulk. There was a weight to it, a density of intention that made the air around it feel thicker, more viscous, as if reality itself was being compressed by its proximity. "Stay calm," Cole ordered, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "Nobody fires unless I give the order. We don't know what these things are capable of, and I don't want to start a fight we can't finish." "Sarge," Morrison said, his voice rising toward panic, "that thing is 15 feet tall and armed with a stinger the size of my forearm. If it attacks, we can't finish the fight. We can't even start it." "Then don't provoke it," Cole snapped. "Stand down, Corporal, lower your weapon." Reluctantly, Morrison lowered his rifle. The Girtablilu watched the movement with its multifaceted eyes, and Cole thought he saw something shift in its posture, a relaxation, perhaps, or a recalculation. The creature's tail stopped swaying, coming to rest in a position that was still threatening but less immediately aggressive. Its pincers opened and closed once, twice, and then settled into a neutral position. "It's responding to our behavior," Tanaka whispered, her eyes wide with realization. "The text said the Guardians judge intent. If we show aggression, they return aggression. If we show submission—" "We're not submitting to a giant scorpion," Morrison interrupted. "I'm not bowing down to—" "Shut up, Jax," Cole growled. "Just shut up and let me think." The Girtablilu remained motionless, watching them with its impossible eyes, and Cole understood with a sinking feeling that they were being given a chance. Not a reprieve, not a pardon, but a moment of evaluation. The creature was waiting to see what they would do next, how they would behave, whether they posed a threat worth destroying or merely a nuisance worth hurting. And in that waiting, in that terrible patient stillness, Cole saw the first glimmer of what their mission truly entailed. They weren't here to retrieve tablets. They weren't here to study a frequency. They were here to be tested, to be judged, to be evaluated by a security system that had been designed by beings who understood the human soul far better than any modern scientist. And if they failed that evaluation, if their hearts were found wanting, their intentions impure, their spirits unclean, they wouldn't simply die. They would be curated, preserved, transformed into living sensors that would serve the threshold for eternity, their nervous systems hijacked to warn future intruders of the fate that awaited them. The Girtablilu shifted its weight again, and the clicking of its chitin against stone sounded almost like language, a rhythmic pattern that might have been communication or might have been merely the natural sounds of its alien biology. But in that clicking, Cole heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a warning, a promise, a statement of purpose that transcended words. The threshold must remain pure, Vane translated softly, his black eyes closed, his head tilted as if listening to frequencies that the others couldn't perceive. The guardians serve. The guardians wait. The gaze of the gate is upon you. Choose wisely, children of dust, for the gate does not open for the unclean, and the underworld has infinite patience. The creature turned, its massive form moving with that terrible fluid grace, and began to retreat toward the space between the petrified peaks. It didn't disappear into the darkness so much as merge with it, its chitin-dark body becoming indistinguishable from the shadows until only the faintest clicking remained, and then silence. But it wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence unperceived. The Girtablilu was still there, still watching, still evaluating. It had simply moved beyond the range of their vision, into the territory where it held absolute advantage. "What do we do?" Vasquez asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Do we proceed? Do we retreat?" "We proceed," Cole said, though every instinct screamed at him to run. "Meridian didn't pay us to turn back at the first sign of opposition. We have a mission. We complete the mission, but we proceed with extreme caution. Tanaka, I want every warning carving translated by morning. Okonkwo, I want a full analysis of that creature's biology and capabilities. Morrison, double the watches and keep your finger off the trigger unless absolutely necessary. Vasquez, prepare trauma kits and antivenom. And Vane." "I will watch," the sensory consultant said, his black eyes open now and fixed on the darkness where the Girtablilu had vanished. "I will listen, and I will tell you when the threshold begins to sing." Cole didn't ask what he meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. They returned to their tents, to their uneasy sleep, to the heavy silence that pressed against their eardrums and made their dreams strange and fragmented. And in the darkness between the twin mountains of Mashu, something ancient and patient continued its vigil, waiting for the dawn, waiting for the next test, waiting for the moment when the children of dust would prove themselves worthy of passage or deserving of the curation that awaited the unclean. The night was long, the silence was heavy, and somewhere in the darkness a scorpion's tail clicked against stone in a rhythm that might have been counting, might have been measuring, might have been anticipating the screams that would soon fill the valley of the threshold. Dawn came to the valley of Mashu with a reluctance that felt almost deliberate, as if the sun itself was hesitant to illuminate what waited in the shadows between the petrified peaks. Cole had managed perhaps 2 hours of fractured sleep, his dreams filled with clicking sounds and multifaceted eyes that reflected his own face distorted into 1,000 screaming variations. He woke to find Tanaka already working on her translations, hunched over her sketchpad in the pale gray light of early morning, her fingers stained with the black dust that seemed to permeate every surface of the valley. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and when she looked up at Cole's approach, he saw a depth of exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. "I finished the translations," she said, her voice raspy. "Most of them, anyway. The secondary layer is still giving me trouble. It's not any language I've ever encountered, and I've spent 15 years studying dead tongues. But the surface text is clear enough. And Sar, it's bad." "How bad?" She gestured to her sketchpad, where pages of neat handwriting were interspersed with reproductions of the carvings. "The warnings aren't just about guardians. They're about a system, an integrated defense network designed to operate autonomously for, well, forever, basically. The Girtablilu aren't monsters in the folklore sense. They're described as soldiers of the threshold, curators of purity, eyes that do not close. There's a whole section about what they do to intruders, and she paused, swallowing hard. It's systematic, methodical. They don't kill for food or for sport. They kill to maintain the threshold. And the ones they don't kill immediately, they curate." "You mentioned curation before," Cole said. "What does it mean exactly?" Tanaka turned to a page near the back of her sketchpad, where a detailed drawing showed human figures fused into walls, their faces contorted in expressions of eternal agony, their bodies merged with the stone in ways that suggested organic transformation rather than simple imprisonment. The carvings describe it as preservation through integration. The Girtablilu have venom that doesn't just paralyze, it transforms. It alters the victim's nervous system, rewires it to serve the threshold rather than the individual. The victims remain alive, technically, but they're no longer autonomous. They become part of the temple's sensory network, living sensors, warning beacons. They feel everything, every footstep, every change in temperature, every shift in electromagnetic frequency, and they transmit that information back to the guardians. "That's insane," Cole said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen too much in his 20 years of service to dismiss anything as impossible. No venom can do that. No biological process can transform a human nervous system into a security camera. "No biological process that we understand," Tanaka corrected. "But the texts describe the Girtablilu as children of Tiamat, created by a goddess of primordial chaos to serve as eternal guardians. If we accept even the possibility that these creatures were engineered by beings with biotechnology far beyond our comprehension." "I don't accept that possibility," Morrison interrupted. He had emerged from his tent, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting constantly toward the shadows between the peaks. "I don't accept any of this supernatural bullshit. That thing last night was big and scary, and probably some kind of genetic experiment that got loose, but it's not a magical scorpion man created by a dead goddess. And I'm not going to stand here while we all psych ourselves out over bedtime stories carved into rocks by superstitious ancients." "Corporal," Cole said, his voice dangerously calm, "you will maintain discipline. We are operating in an unknown environment with unknown threats, and I will not tolerate panic or insubordination. Is that clear?" "Crystal, Sarge," Morrison snapped, but his hand was on his sidearm again, and Cole could see the tremor in his fingers. "The texts also describe something else," Tanaka continued, ignoring Morrison's outburst. "They describe the gaze of death. It's not a physical attack. It's described as the seeing that unmakes, the judgment that freezes, the reflection of all endings in the eyes of the eternal. When a Girtablilu looks at you with full intent, you experience," she consulted her notes, "the accumulated screams of every soul that has perished in the desert, pressed into the mind in an instant. It's a psychic overload. The texts say that strong men die from it instantly, their hearts bursting from the shock. Others survive but are paralyzed, their minds shattered by the weight of the suffering they've witnessed." "And then the stinger comes," Okonkwo added. He had been listening from the entrance to his tent, his scanner forgotten in his hands. The paralysis allows the Girtablilu to deliver the venom with surgical precision. The victim can't fight, can't flee, can't do anything but experience the full horror of their impending transformation. "We need to abort," Vasquez said quietly. She had emerged from her tent fully dressed, her medic's bag already packed, her expression set in the calm mask of someone who had made a decision. "This mission is compromised. We have one confirmed hostile entity of unknown capabilities, evidence of a biological weapon system that defies conventional understanding, and a site that is actively hostile to human life. We need to call for extraction and get out before anyone else gets hurt." "No extraction," Vane said. He had been sitting motionless on a rock near the camp's perimeter, his black eyes fixed on the peaks, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "The helicopter will not come. The radio will not function. The threshold has been activated, and once activated, it does not release its participants until the ceremony is complete. We entered of our own free will. We must exit the same way, or not at all." "That's not how this works," Cole said, though his stomach was sinking. "Meridian has protocols. If we don't check in, they'll send." "They will send nothing," Vane interrupted, "because they cannot find us. The threshold exists in a space between coordinates. The satellite that imaged this location saw what the threshold wished it to see. The helicopter that brought you here flew through air that was shaped by the threshold's desire for visitors. You are not in the Rub al Khali anymore, Sergeant Cole. You are in the space that the Rub al Khali occupies when the world is not looking, and the only way back is through the gate." "You're saying we're trapped?" Morrison's voice rose toward hysteria. "We're actually trapped in some kind of magical pocket dimension with a giant scorpion monster." "I am saying that the categories you use to understand reality are inadequate to your current situation. I am saying that you must adapt, or you will die. And I am saying that the Girtablilu are not a giant scorpion monster. They are the guardians of a threshold that separates the living world from something older and hungrier than your species can comprehend. Treat them with the respect that their function demands, and you may survive. Treat them as enemies to be destroyed, and you will become part of the garden." "The garden," Tanaka whispered, her face going pale. "The texts mention a garden, where the curated grow, a garden of warning, a field of eyes that never close." "Show me," Cole commanded. They broke camp with a speed born of renewed fear, packing their essential equipment and leaving the rest for whatever fate awaited abandoned gear in the valley of Mashu. Vane led them toward the space between the twin peaks, his movements slow and deliberate, his body language broadcasting submission and respect in every gesture. The others followed in a tight cluster, their weapons held at the ready despite Cole's orders, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The passage between the peaks was narrower than it had appeared from a distance, a defile barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast, its walls rising in sheer cliffs of basalt that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The black dust underfoot grew thicker as they progressed, until it was ankle-deep, then knee-deep, a fine powder that got into their boots and their socks and the spaces between their toes, carrying with it a cold that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. The temperature dropped as they advanced, and Cole found himself shivering despite the exertion of walking through the clinging dust. "The dust," Okonkwo said, his voice hushed. "It's not volcanic. Look at it under magnification." He held out his scanner and Cole peered at the screen. The image showed the dust at extreme magnification, and what Cole saw made his stomach turn. The particles weren't mineral fragments. They were organic. Tiny, desiccated fragments of chitin and bone and something else, something fibrous and pale that Okonkwo identified as degraded nervous tissue. The valley floor wasn't covered in volcanic ash. It was covered in the remains of the Girtablilu's victims, ground down by millennia of wind, and whether into a powder so fine it might as well have been sand. "We're walking through the dead," Vasquez said, her voice flat. "This entire valley is a mass grave." "Not dead," Vane corrected. "Curated. The garden is not a cemetery. It is a collection, a living archive of every soul that has ever sought to violate the threshold. The defile opened abruptly into a vast chamber that made Cole stop in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. It was a cathedral of stone, a natural cavern that had been shaped and enhanced by tools or by time into something that resembled a temple more than a cave. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet above them, lost in darkness that their flashlights couldn't penetrate. The walls were covered in more carvings, thousands upon thousands of symbols and images that covered every available surface in a dense tapestry of warning and history. And the floor was the garden. It stretched before them like a field of strange crops, rows upon rows of human figures embedded in the stone, their bodies fused with the basalt at waist or chest or neck, their arms raised above their heads in poses that suggested either supplication or agony. They were still alive. Cole knew it instantly, knew it with a certainty that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the primitive part of his brain that understood predator and prey, life and death, suffering and its absence. The figures moved, twitching, their fingers flexing, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Their eyes were open, and they tracked the team's movement with a synchronized precision that suggested a single consciousness distributed across multiple bodies. "My God," Tanaka whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "There must be hundreds of them, thousands." "The garden of the curated," Vane said softly. "Every explorer who ever found this place, every soldier who ever tried to claim it, every archaeologist, every treasure hunter, every curious soul who thought they could bypass the guardians and steal the threshold secrets. They are all here. They will all be here. Forever." Cole forced himself to look closer at the nearest figure, a man in tattered clothing that might have been military issue from decades past. His body was fused into the basalt from the waist down, the stone having somehow merged with his flesh in a way that suggested biological integration rather than simple imprisonment. His skin was gray and desiccated, stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent, but his eyes were bright and aware, tracking Cole's movement with an intelligence that was undiminished by his condition. When Cole met his gaze, the man's mouth opened wider, and though no sound emerged, Cole felt something press against his mind. A sensation of screaming, of endless, infinite screaming, transmitted directly from the curated man's shattered psyche into his own. "Don't look in their eyes," Vane warned. "They are sensors, yes, but they are also transmitters. They will share their suffering with you if you let them. They are desperate for contact, for sensation, for anything that reminds them they were once human, and their desperation is infectious." Cole jerked his gaze away, his heart hammering, his palms sweating despite the cold. "How do we get past them?" "Carefully," Vane said. "The garden is a warning, but it is also a filter. Those who cannot maintain their composure in the presence of the curated are deemed unworthy of further progress. They become part of the garden themselves. Walk slowly. Do not run. Do not touch the curated. And above all, do not show fear. The Girtablilu can smell fear. They can taste it in the electromagnetic fluctuations of your nervous system." They entered the garden in single file, Vane leading, Cole bringing up the rear. The path between the rows of curated was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, and it wound through the field of fused bodies in patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than random placement. The curated watched them pass, their eyes tracking, their mouths working, their fingers twitching in gestures that might have been warnings or might have been pleas for help. Cole felt their attention like a physical weight, a pressure against his skull that made his vision blur and his steps falter. "Sarge," Morrison whispered from ahead, "I can hear them in my head. They're screaming, they're all screaming." "Focus on your breathing," Cole ordered, though he could hear it too now. A faint, high-pitched whine that seemed to emanate from somewhere inside his own mind, the cumulative psychic residue of 1,000 souls trapped in eternal agony. "One step at a time. Keep moving." They were halfway through the garden when the Girtablilu struck. Not from the front, where Vane walked with his careful, deliberate pace, but from above. Cole heard the sound first, a rush of air, a clicking of chitin, and then the shadow fell across them, blocking out the dim light that filtered from the cavern entrance. He looked up to see a Girtablilu descending from the ceiling, its massive body clinging to the stone with pincers and tail, its multifaceted eyes fixed on the team with terrible focus. "Don't move," Vane shouted, but Morrison was already reacting, his fear overwhelming his training. The young corporal raised his rifle and fired, 3 quick shots that cracked through the cavern with deafening echoes. The bullets struck the Girtablilu's chitin armor and ricocheted away with sparks of light, leaving no mark, no wound, no sign of damage. The creature didn't flinch. It didn't recoil. It simply turned its full attention on Morrison, and its multifaceted eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that Cole felt in his bones rather than saw with his eyes. The gaze of death, the seeing that unmakes, the reflection of all endings in the eyes of the eternal. Morrison froze. His rifle dropped from nerveless fingers, clattering against the stone. His eyes went wide, then wider, until the whites showed all around his irises, and his mouth opened in a scream that produced no sound. He stood rigid, trembling, his body locked in a paralysis that seemed to originate from within rather than without. And in his eyes, Cole saw the reflection of what the Girtablilu was showing him. Not a single death, but all deaths, the accumulated suffering of every creature that had ever perished in the desert, compressed into a single instant of absolute horror. "Jax," Cole shouted, lunging forward, but Vane caught his arm with surprising strength. "Don't," the sensory consultant hissed. "If you touch him while the gaze is upon him, you will share his fate. The connection is open. The only way to survive is to wait." "Wait for what? For him to die?" "Wait for the curation to begin." The Girtablilu descended the rest of the way, its massive form landing beside Morrison with an impact that shook the cavern floor. The creature moved with a terrible gentleness, its pincers reaching out to cradle Morrison's paralyzed form, lifting him as easily as a child lifts a doll. The stinger rose above its back, glistening with venom that caught the dim light and seemed to pulse with its own inner luminescence. And then, with a precision that suggested millennia of practice, the stinger struck. It didn't pierce Morrison's chest or abdomen. It struck the base of his skull, at the precise point where the spinal cord met the brainstem, and the venom entered his system in a flood that was visible as a dark stain spreading beneath his skin. Morrison's paralyzed scream cut off abruptly, and his body went limp in the Girtablilu's pincers, but his eyes remained open, aware, terrified. The creature held him for a moment, its multifaceted eyes studying its handiwork, and then it moved toward the wall of the cavern, selecting a spot between 2 other curated figures, and began the process of integration. Cole watched, unable to look away, as the Girtablilu pressed Morrison's body against the basalt, and the stone began to change. It didn't crack or break. It softened, became almost liquid, flowing around Morrison's legs and waist and chest, pulling him into itself with a slow, inevitable motion that suggested geological time compressed into minutes. Morrison's mouth opened in a silent scream as the stone merged with his flesh, his fingers clawing at the air, his eyes rolling in their sockets. And then the integration was complete, and Morrison stood, or rather hung, among the other curated, his body fused with the wall from the waist down, his arms raised, his mouth frozen in that eternal silent scream. But his eyes moved. They tracked Cole's position with the same awareness that the other curated had shown, and in those eyes, Cole saw something that made his blood run cold. He saw Jax Morrison still inside there, still conscious, still aware, his mind intact but his body hijacked, transformed into another sensor for the Threshold's endless vigil. "He can still see us," Vasquez whispered, her voice breaking. "He's still in there. He knows what's happening to him." "He will know forever," Vane said. "That is the nature of curation. The body is preserved. The mind is preserved. Only the will is removed. They become extensions of the threshold, eyes that never close, ears that never stop listening, and they remain aware of their condition. That awareness is part of what makes them effective sensors. The pain sharpens the perception. "We need to get out of here," Tanaka said, her voice rising toward panic. "We need to find another way. We can't go through this garden. We can't." "There is no other way," Vane interrupted. "The garden surrounds the inner temple. The only path to the tablets, to the frequency, to the gate itself, is through the curated, and the Girtablilu will not allow us to retreat. They are hurting us, Sergeant, can't you see? They have been hurting us since we entered the valley. This is not a hunt. This is a drive. They are pushing us toward the center, toward the threshold, because that is where the final judgment takes place." "Why?" Cole demanded, his control slipping, his voice cracking with the strain of what he had witnessed. "Why not just kill us all here? Why the elaborate herding?" "Because the threshold demands purity," Vane said, "and purity cannot be judged from a distance. It must be tested. It must be proven. The Girtablilu are not merely executioners. They are examiners. They herd the impure toward the center because the center is where the final determination is made. Those who reach the gate without being curated are given a choice, passage if they are worthy or destruction if they are not. But the choice must be offered. That is the protocol. That is the law that binds even the guardians." "And if we refuse to be herded?" Okonkwo asked. "Then they will force us, as they forced Morrison, as they will force any who resist." The Girtablilu that had taken Morrison had retreated to the shadows, but Cole could feel its presence still, watching from the darkness, waiting for the next opportunity to cull the herd. The remaining 5 team members stood in the path between the rows of curated, surrounded by the silent screaming of the garden, and Cole understood with terrible clarity that their options had narrowed to a single point. Forward, always forward, through the garden, through the temple, to the gate and whatever waited beyond. "Move out," Cole ordered, his voice barely recognizable as his own. "Single file, stay close, and for God's sake don't look them in the eyes." They continued through the garden, their steps slow and careful, their breathing shallow and controlled. The curated watched them pass with their endless, aware eyes, and Cole felt their attention like insects crawling across his skin. The psychic screaming had faded to a background whine, a constant pressure against his consciousness that he was slowly learning to ignore, but it never disappeared entirely. It was the sound of suffering made manifest, the ambient noise of the threshold security system, and it would continue until they either escaped or joined the garden themselves. The path wound deeper into the cavern, the rows of curated growing denser, the figures more recent in appearance. Cole passed a woman in modern hiking gear, her face frozen in an expression of surprise rather than agony, as if she had been taken before she fully understood her danger. He passed a man in military uniform that might have been Soviet era, his body more thoroughly integrated with the stone, his eyes dimmer but still aware. He passed children, their small forms fused with the wall at chest height, their eyes wide and empty, and he felt something break inside him at the sight, some final barrier between his professional composure and his human horror. "Children," he whispered, "they took children." "The threshold does not distinguish," Vane said. "Age, innocence, intention, none of these matter to the guardians. What matters is purity. What matters is the capacity to withstand the gaze. Children are often more sensitive than adults. They see more clearly, and what they see in the Girtablilu's eyes is often enough to break them before the curation even begins." "How do we survive this?" Cole asked, not really expecting an answer. "How do we get through the gate without becoming part of this nightmare?" "By understanding what the Guardians truly serve," Vane said. "They are soldiers of Tiamat, yes. They are devoted to maintaining the purity of the threshold, but their devotion is not mindless. It is disciplined. It follows rules. And the most important rule is this: the gate opens for those who move without intent. It opens for those who approach without desire. It opens for those who have emptied themselves of everything, ambition, fear, hope, despair, and become pure presence. The Girtablilu cannot harm what does not wish to be harmed. They cannot judge what offers nothing to judge. Move without intent, Tanaka repeated, her voice hollow. Approach without desire. How is that even possible? We're here because Meridian hired us to retrieve something. We have objectives. We have goals. We're not monks. We're not ascetics. We're mercenaries. Then you must become something else, Vane said. Or you must die. Those are the only options that the Threshold recognizes. They emerged from the garden into a space that was somehow worse than the curated field. It was a maze of towering formations that might have been natural stalagmites, or might have been the petrified remains of other creatures. Their shapes twisted and organic in ways that made Cole's eyes water trying to focus on them. The space between the formations was narrow, barely shoulder-width in places, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the beams of their flashlights that seemed to be swallowed by the blackness almost as soon as they left the source. The inner temple, Okonkwo said, his voice hushed. The carvings described this, a labyrinth of stone and bone where the geometry shifts and the paths change, where the Girtablilu hunt those who have passed the garden but not yet reached the gate. The geometry shift, Cole asked. The frequency, Vane said. The cosmic vibration. It doesn't just emanate from the threshold, it shapes the space around it. The Girtablilu are manipulating the vibration, using it to alter the physical layout of the temple. What was a clear path a moment ago may be a dead end the next. What was a wall may become a passage. The only constant is the center, the gate itself, and even its location is relative, not absolute. Then how do we find it? Vasquez demanded. We don't, Vane said. It finds us, when we are ready, when we have become what we need to become. That's not good enough, Cole said. I need concrete directions. I need a plan. I can't lead these people through a shifting maze based on mystical nonsense about purity and intent. Then perhaps you should not lead, Vane said, his black eyes meeting Cole's with an intensity that was almost painful. Perhaps leadership in this context is not a virtue but a burden. Perhaps the weight of command is what makes your heart heavy, Sergeant. Perhaps your desire to protect your team is what the Girtablilu sense when they evaluate you. Perhaps the only way to survive is to stop being Sergeant Cole and start being nothing. No one. Pure presence without identity. You're talking about ego death, Tanaka said, her academic instincts surfacing despite the horror of their situation. Complete dissolution of the self. The texts mention something similar, becoming the breath that passes through, being the wind that touches but is not touched. I am talking about survival, Vane said, however you wish to name it. The gate opens for the empty, and emptiness is the hardest thing for humans to achieve. They moved deeper into the maze, and Vane's warnings proved prophetic. The paths shifted around them, walls sliding into place where passages had been, openings appearing where solid stone had stood moments before. Cole tried to keep track of their direction, to maintain a mental map of their progress, but the shifting geometry made orientation impossible. They walked in circles, backtracked, found themselves in chambers they had already passed through, their flashlights revealing footprints in the black dust that were their own. The Girtablilu hunted them through the maze, not with the direct aggression that had taken Morrison, but with a more subtle pressure, a constant presence at the edges of their vision, the clicking of chitin against stone that came from multiple directions at once. Cole caught glimpses of them in the shadows, not one creature now, but several, their massive forms moving with that terrible fluid grace through passages that should have been too narrow for their bulk. They were herding, just as Vane had said, driving the team toward the center with the relentless patience of beings who had been performing this function for longer than human civilization had existed. 2 o'clock, Vasquez whispered, her hand pointing to a gap between two stalagmite-like formations. Movement, big. And 10 o'clock, Tanaka added. I see another one, they're surrounding us. Don't run, Vane instructed, his voice steady despite the rising panic in the others. Running triggers the pursuit instinct. They are predators, yes, but they are also disciplined. They will not strike unless we give them reason. What reason did Morrison give them? Cole demanded. He fired his weapon, he showed aggression. That was his reason, and it was enough. Then learn from his mistake, Vane said. Control your fear, control your anger, control every impulse that rises from the primitive parts of your brain. Be nothing, want nothing, fear nothing, and perhaps the gate will find you before the guardians do. It was Okonkwo who fell next. The geophysicist had been bringing up the rear, his scanner held before him like a talisman, when the floor beneath him simply ceased to exist. One moment he was walking on solid stone, the next the stone had liquefied, flowing away from his feet like water, and he was falling into a pit that opened beneath him with terrible suddenness. Cole heard his scream, heard it cut off abruptly, and when he reached the edge of the pit, his flashlight beam revealed a nightmare. The pit was filled with venomous larvae, pale, segmented things that writhed and squirmed in a pool of viscous fluid that smelled of ammonia and rotting flowers. Okonkwo was submerged to his chest, his hands clawing at the walls of the pit, his mouth open in a scream that produced no sound because the larvae were already at his face, already burrowing into his ears and nostrils and the corners of his eyes. The Girtablilu didn't use this method for curation, Cole realized with sickening clarity. This was something else. This was disposal. This was what happened to those who weren't even worth preserving as censors. Sam, Tanaka screamed, lunging toward the pit, but Cole caught her, held her back with an arm around her waist. Don't, he said, his voice breaking. There's nothing we can do, he's gone. He's still alive. Tanaka struggled against his grip, her fists beating against his chest. We can't just leave him, we can't. He's not alive, Vane said quietly. Not in any way that matters. The larvae are consuming his nervous system, replacing it with their own. By the time they finish, there will be nothing left of Dr. Okonkwo but a shell filled with insect tissue. It is a mercy that he will not survive the process. Tanaka stopped struggling. She went limp in Cole's arms, her sobs rising in the darkness, and Cole held her because it was the only thing he could do, because the alternative was to stand alone in the maze and let the screaming take him. They were 4 now, 4 where they had been 6, and the gate was still somewhere ahead, somewhere in the shifting darkness, waiting for them to prove themselves worthy of passage or deserving of the fates that had claimed Morrison and Okonkwo. We need to keep moving, Cole said, his voice hollow. We can't stay here. The smell of the pit will draw the others. The others are already here, Vasquez said. She was standing at the edge of the flashlight's reach, her medic's bag clutched to her chest, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. They've been here the whole time, watching, waiting, deciding which of us is next. She was right. Cole could feel them now, the Girtablilu, their presence pressing against his consciousness like a weight. They weren't attacking. They were evaluating. They were selecting. And Cole understood with terrible certainty that the selection process was nearing its conclusion. The gate, Vane said, his voice distant, almost dreamy. I can feel it, it's close. The frequency is stronger now, it's singing. Singing what? Cole asked. Singing home, Vane said. Singing the end. Singing the threshold that waits between what was and what will be. They moved through the maze, and the walls closed in around them, and the darkness pressed against their eyeballs, and the clicking of chitin against stone was their only companion in the void. The Girtablilu were herding them toward the center, toward the final judgment, and Cole understood that the worst was yet to come. The garden had been horror, the maze was terror, but the gate would be something else entirely. Something that would test the limits of what it meant to be human, what it meant to be alive, what it meant to stand before the absolute and hope to be found worthy. The frequency grew stronger as they advanced, a vibration that Cole felt in his teeth and his bones and the fluid behind his eyes. It was no longer subsonic. It was audible now, a low hum that rose and fell in patterns that almost suggested music, almost suggested language, almost suggested the heartbeat of something vast and ancient that was stirring in its sleep, dreaming of the world it had left behind. "The threshold," Tanaka whispered. "We're almost there." "Almost," Vane agreed. "But the final test is the hardest. The gate does not open for those who merely survive. It opens for those who have become worthy of passage. And worthiness, in the language of the threshold, is not a quality but a state. It is the emptiness that allows the light to pass through. It is the silence between heartbeats. It is the space that exists when the self has been surrendered." "I don't know how to surrender myself," Cole admitted, and the confession felt like a stone dropping from his chest. "I've been a soldier my whole life. I've defined myself by duty, by command, by the weight of responsibility. I don't know who I am without that." "Then perhaps," Vane said, "you must learn or you must die." The maze opened before them, the walls parting like curtains, and they found themselves in a chamber that dwarfed anything they had seen before. It was a vast space, circular, its ceiling lost in darkness above, its floor polished to a mirror-like sheen that reflected the dim light in ways that made orientation impossible. And in the center of the chamber, shimmering like heat haze on a summer road, was the gate. It wasn't a door. It wasn't a portal. It was an atmospheric distortion, a place where the air seemed to fold in on itself, creating a lens effect that showed not what was on the other side but what might be, what could be, what existed in the spaces between possibilities. Through the distortion, Cole caught glimpses of impossible landscapes, deserts that stretched into infinity, cities of crystal and bone, rivers that flowed upward into skies of absolute black. And somewhere in those glimpses, somewhere in the shimmering unreality of the gate, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. He saw home, not his actual home, not the small apartment in London where he kept his sparse possessions and his even sparser memories. He saw the idea of home, the concept of belonging, the warmth of a place where he was known and accepted and loved. He saw it, and he wanted it, and the wanting was a physical pain in his chest that made his eyes water and his hands clench into fists. "Don't look," Vane warned. "The gate shows you what you desire. It tempts you with your own heart's deepest longing. And the moment you reach for it, the moment you allow desire to move you, you are lost. The threshold opens only for the empty. Desire is the weight that drags you down." Cole tore his gaze away from the gate, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. He could still see the image of home burned into his retinas, still feel the ache of longing that threatened to overwhelm his reason. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins, that this was the final test. Not combat, not endurance, not courage in the face of physical danger. The final test was desire itself, the ability to stand before everything you had ever wanted and to walk away from it, empty-handed, empty-hearted, empty of everything that made you human. The Girtablilu emerged from the shadows around the chamber's perimeter, not one or two but a dozen at least, their massive forms forming a circle around the gate, their multifaceted eyes fixed on the four surviving humans with an attention that was almost gentle, almost welcoming. They weren't attacking. They were witnesses. They were the jury for the final judgment, and they had gathered to see whether the children of dust could pass through the threshold or whether they would join the garden of the curated. "This is it," Cole said, his voice barely audible. "This is the end." "This is the beginning," Vane corrected. "If you can pass, if you can become what the threshold demands. And if we can't, then we become part of the garden, and our screams join the others, forever." The four of them stood at the edge of the gate, surrounded by the silent, watching Girtablilu, and Cole understood that the most horrifying moment of his life was not the violence or the death, or the monstrous creatures that had hunted them through the maze. The most horrifying moment was this one, this moment of choice, when he had to decide whether to hold onto everything that made him who he was, or to let it all go and hope that emptiness was enough to save him. The gate shimmered, the frequency hummed, and the Girtablilu waited with the patience of eternity, their chitin clicking softly against the stone in a rhythm that might have been counting, might have been measuring, might have been singing the song of the threshold that had been waiting for them since the beginning of time. The gate shimmered before them, a distortion in the fabric of reality that showed glimpses of impossible worlds and half-remembered dreams, and Cole felt the weight of his own desire pressing against his chest with a physical force that made it hard to breathe. He had faced enemy fire in a dozen war zones. He had watched friends die and had killed men who were trying to kill him. He had survived situations that should have been fatal through sheer force of will and stubborn refusal to surrender. But standing here, at the threshold of Mashu, surrounded by the silent, watching Girtablilu, he understood that willpower was not the currency this place accepted. Strength was not the virtue it rewarded. Courage, determination, loyalty, all the qualities that had made him an effective soldier, were precisely the qualities that would destroy him here. "How do we do this?" Vasquez asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the frequency. She was staring at the gate with an expression of blank horror, as if she could see something in its shimmering depths that the others couldn't. "How do we empty ourselves? How do we stop wanting?" "I understanding that wanting is the chain that binds you," Vane said. He had moved closer to the gate than the others, close enough that the atmospheric distortion made his form shimmer and blur at the edges, as if he was already halfway through the transition. By recognizing that every desire, every ambition, every attachment is a weight that drags the soul down, the Girtablilu don't judge you by what you've done. They judge you by what you still want to do, by what you still cling to, by what you cannot release. "I don't know how to stop clinging," Tanaka admitted. Her hands were shaking, her sketchpad forgotten at her feet, her eyes fixed on the gate with a longing that Cole recognized because he felt it too. "I have a daughter. She's 12. She lives with her father in Tokyo, and I haven't seen her in 2 years because I took this job, because I thought the money would give her a better life. And now I'm standing here and all I can think about is getting back to her, holding her, telling her I'm sorry for all the time I missed. That's not a selfish desire. That's love. How can love be wrong?" "Love is not wrong," Vane said softly. "But love is weight, and the threshold demands lightness. It does not judge your desires as good or evil. It simply measures their mass. The mother who clings to her child weighs more than the monk who has released all attachment. The mother may be morally superior. She may be kinder, warmer, more human, but she is heavier, and heaviness cannot pass through the gate." "Then the gate is monstrous," Cole said, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to suppress. "If it demands that we abandon love, abandon connection, abandon everything that makes life worth living, then it's not a gateway to enlightenment. It's a gateway to annihilation." "Perhaps," Vane agreed. "Or perhaps enlightenment and annihilation are the same thing viewed from different angles. The threshold does not promise happiness, Sergeant. It promises passage, and passage requires payment." The Girtablilu shifted around them, their chitin clicking against the polished stone, their multifaceted eyes reflecting the gate's shimmer in 1,000 tiny fragments of light. They weren't attacking, but Cole could feel their attention intensifying, their patience thinning. The time for discussion was ending. The time for choice was approaching. And the choice was not whether to pass through the gate, but whether they could pay the price that passage demanded. "I can't do it," Tanaka said, and her voice broke on the words. "I can't let go of my daughter, I won't. Even if it means I die here, even if it means I become part of the garden. She is the reason I breathe. She is the weight that keeps me anchored to the world, and I would rather be anchored and drown than float free and empty." "Then you have made your choice," Vane said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only sadness. "The threshold accepts all choices. That is its nature. It does not force. It does not coerce. It simply presents the price and allows each soul to decide whether to pay." Tanaka turned to Cole, her eyes wet with tears, and she reached out to touch his arm. "Go," she said. "If you can pass, if you can become what they want you to become, go, don't stay for me. Don't die for me. Someone needs to survive. Someone needs to tell the world what happened here. Someone needs to make sure my daughter knows that I didn't abandon her because I didn't love her. I abandoned her because I loved her too much." "Yuki," Cole began, but she shook her head, stepping back from him, back toward the Girtablilu that waited with terrible patience. "No," she said, "don't make this harder. I've made my choice. Now make yours." She turned and walked toward the creatures, her steps steady despite the trembling in her shoulders, and Cole watched, frozen, as the nearest Girtablilu moved to meet her. But instead of attacking, instead of curation or destruction, the creature simply stood before her, its massive form blocking the path to the gate. It was waiting, Cole realized. Waiting to see if she would change her mind, if she would release her attachment and step through, or if she would hold fast to her love and accept the consequences. Tanaka stopped before the creature, looking up into its multifaceted eyes, and for a long moment human and guardian stood in silent communion. Then Tanaka reached into her pocket and withdrew a photograph creased and worn, a picture of a young girl with Tanaka's eyes and her father's smile, and she pressed it to her chest, holding it there with both hands. "No," she whispered. "I won't let go, not even for you, not even for this." The Girtablilu made a sound that might have been a sigh, might have been a judgment, might have been the ancient equivalent of respect. Its tail rose above its back, the stinger gleaming, and Cole turned away. He couldn't watch. He couldn't bear to see another member of his team fall, another person he had failed to protect, another life sacrificed on the altar of this terrible place. He heard the sound of the stinger striking, heard Tanaka's sharp intake of breath, heard the soft thud of her body hitting the stone. But he didn't hear screaming. He didn't hear agony. When he finally turned back, compelled by a horrible curiosity, he saw that Tanaka had not been curated. She had not been integrated into the garden. She lay on the polished floor, her eyes closed, her chest still rising and falling, her body apparently intact. The Girtablilu had struck her with the flat of its stinger rather than the point, delivering not venom but something else, a toxin that induced sleep perhaps, or a deeper state of unconsciousness that preserved her for later judgment. "She is not worthy of passage," Vane said, his voice soft. "But she is not worthy of curation either. Her love, though heavy, is pure. The guardians recognize purity even in weight. They will keep her, preserve her. Perhaps in time she will learn to carry her love more lightly and the gate will open for her. Or perhaps she'll sleep forever while her daughter grows up without a mother," Cole said, his voice bitter. "Is that mercy? Is that justice?" "It is what it is," Vane replied. "The threshold does not deal in human categories." 3 remained: Cole, Vasquez, and Vane. And the gate shimmered before them, its impossible vistas beckoning and forbidding in equal measure. The Girtablilu had closed their circle tighter, their massive forms pressing inward, herding the survivors toward the gate with a persistence that suggested time was running out. "I have a theory," Vasquez said suddenly. She had been silent since Tanaka's fall, her medic's bag clutched to her chest, her face pale but composed. "About how to pass. About what emptiness really means." "Speak," Vane said. "The guardians judge intent. They smell desire. They evaluate the weight of our attachments. But what if the way through isn't to stop wanting, but to stop caring about wanting? What if the emptiness they demand isn't the absence of desire, but the absence of identification with desire? I can want to go home. I can want to survive. But I don't have to believe that those wants define me. I don't have to make them the center of my existence." "That is the teaching of the ancient masters," Vane said, his black eyes showing something that might have been surprise. "The recognition that the self is not the desires but the awareness that contains them. You are wise, Elena Vasquez, wiser than you know." "I'm not wise," Vasquez said. "I'm just tired. Tired of carrying the weight of everything I've seen and done. Tired of defining myself by my traumas. Tired of being the person who survived when so many others didn't." She stepped toward the gate, her movements slow and deliberate, and the Girtablilu watched her with their multifaceted eyes, evaluating, measuring, weighing. Vasquez didn't look at them. She didn't look at the gate. She looked inward, her eyes half closed, her breathing deep and rhythmic, and Cole saw something shift in her posture. A relaxation, a release, a surrender that was not defeat but acceptance. "I want to live," she said aloud, her voice clear and steady. "I want to see my family again. I want to feel the sun on my face and breathe air that doesn't smell like death. I want all these things, but I am not these wants. They are part of me, but they are not the whole of me. And if I must release them to pass through, then I release them. Not because I don't want them, but because I trust that the part of me that remains when the wants are gone is still enough, is still worthy, is still whole." The gate shimmered, and for a moment, Cole thought he saw it respond to her words, its distortion rippling outward in patterns that suggested recognition, acceptance, approval. The Girtablilu nearest to Vasquez stepped aside, its massive bulk withdrawing to create a path to the gate, and Vasquez walked forward, not running, not hurrying, simply moving with the steady pace of someone who had found her center and was content to let the world arrange itself around her. She reached the gate. She paused at its threshold, looking back at Cole with an expression that was almost peaceful. "Come on, Sarge," she said. "It's not so bad, the emptiness, it's not empty. It's full of something else, something quieter, something." She stepped through. The distortion swallowed her like water closing over a stone, and she was gone. Not dead, not destroyed, passed through. And Cole stood alone with Vane, surrounded by the clicking guardians, and felt the weight of his own heart pressing against his ribs with a force that threatened to crack them. "You are the last," Vane said, "and you are the heaviest. Your sense of responsibility, your need to protect, your guilt over those you have lost, these are not impurities, Sergeant. They are virtues, but they are heavy virtues, and the gate will not open for heaviness." "Then I'll stay," Cole said, the decision forming in his mind even as he spoke it. "I'll stay with Tanaka. I'll stay with the garden. I'll accept curation or death or whatever else this place has in store for me. But I won't abandon who I am. I won't become empty just to survive." "Admirable," Vane said, "and also foolish. But perhaps there is another way." "What other way?" "The gate opens for emptiness. But emptiness is not the only path. There is also sacrifice, the giving of the self for another, the willingness to bear the weight so that others need not. It is a different kind of purity, not the emptiness of the monk, but the fullness of the martyr. And the threshold recognizes it, even if it does not always reward it with passage." "You're talking about dying for someone else." "I am talking about choosing to carry the weight rather than escape it. To stand in the fire so that others may reach the cool water. It is not suicide, Sergeant. It is surrender. And surrender, paradoxically, is the heaviest thing of all." The Girtablilu were pressing closer now, their patience clearly nearing its end. Cole could feel the vibration of their chitin against the stone, could smell their predator musk filling the air, could sense the terrible weight of their attention pressing against his mind like a physical force. Time was running out. The ceremony was approaching its conclusion, and Cole had to make his choice. He thought of everyone he had lost. Morrison, paralyzed by the gaze, integrated into the garden. Okonkwo, consumed by larvae in a pit of venomous waste. Tanaka, sleeping in eternal preservation because she loved too much. Vasquez, passed through because she had found a way to release her attachments without losing herself. And Vane. What about Vane? The sensory consultant who seemed to understand this place in ways that transcended human comprehension. "What about you?" Cole asked. "What's your choice?" Vane smiled, and it was the first time Cole had seen him smile, a gentle expression that transformed his severe features into something almost beautiful. "I have no choice to make, Sergeant. I am already empty. I have been empty for a very long time. The gate opened for me the moment we entered this chamber. I have simply been waiting for the rest of you to reach your own decisions." "Then why haven't you passed through?" "Because I chose to stay, to help, to witness. Someone had to remain to explain the rules, to translate the customs, to guide the children of dust through the threshold's judgment, and I volunteered." Volunteered for what? To die here, to be curated. To serve, Vane said. As the Girtablilu serve, as the threshold serves. There are many kinds of emptiness, Sergeant. Mine is the emptiness of function. I am what the threshold needs me to be, nothing more, nothing less. Cole looked at the gate, at the shimmering distortion that showed glimpses of home and worlds beyond counting. He looked at Tanaka's sleeping form, at the Girtablilu that surrounded them like judges in a courtroom of stone and shadow. And he looked inward, at the weight of his own heart, at the accumulated mass of a lifetime's responsibility and guilt and desperate, futile love. He couldn't empty himself. He knew that now. He was too full, too heavy, too saturated with the weight of his own identity. He was Sergeant Darius Cole, and he had been Sergeant Darius Cole for 20 years, and he didn't know how to be anyone else. But perhaps he didn't need to be empty. Perhaps he could be full and heavy and still find a way through. The tablets, Cole said suddenly. The obsidian tablets that Meridian wanted, the frequency they were supposed to contain. Where are they? At the threshold, Vane said. Beyond the gate. They are not objects to be retrieved but truths to be understood, and understanding requires passage. Then I'll retrieve them, Cole said. Not for Meridian, not for the money, but because someone needs to know. Someone needs to carry this knowledge back to the world to warn others, to prevent more people from stumbling into this nightmare. If I can't empty myself, I can at least fill myself with purpose. And maybe purpose is heavy enough to break through. Purpose is heavy, Vane agreed. But it is also directed. It is weight with trajectory, and the threshold respects trajectory even more than it respects lightness. Cole stepped toward the gate. The Girtablilu didn't move to intercept him. They simply watched, their multifaceted eyes tracking his progress, their chitin clicking softly in what might have been encouragement or might have been anticipation. Cole felt the frequency intensify as he approached the shimmering distortion, felt it resonating in his bones and his teeth and the fluid behind his eyes, felt it trying to pull something out of him, some essential quality that the gate needed to open. He thought of Morrison, screaming in silence as the Girtablilu's gaze shattered his mind. He thought of Okonkwo, consumed by larvae in the dark. He thought of Tanaka, sleeping with her daughter's photograph pressed to her chest. He thought of Vasquez, passing through with her quiet acceptance. And he thought of all the others who had come before them, the curated in the garden, the endless screaming that was the threshold's ambient noise. He would carry them. He would carry their weight along with his own. He would be the heaviest heart that ever approached the gate, and he would use that weight like a battering ram, forcing his way through by sheer force of accumulated purpose. It was not the way the threshold intended. It was not the path of emptiness and lightness, but it was his path. It was the only path he knew how to walk. The gate shimmered before him, and he reached out to touch it. The distortion felt like cold water against his fingertips, like liquid glass, like the boundary between waking and dreaming. And then he was through, falling forward into a space that wasn't space, a place that wasn't a place, a condition of existence that defied all the categories his human mind had constructed to make sense of the world. He was in the frequency. He was the frequency. He was vibrating at a rate that made his physical form seem irrelevant, that reduced his body to a pattern of energy and information dancing on the edge of dissolution. He could see everything and nothing. He could feel everything and nothing. He was aware of the tablets, not as physical objects but as concentrations of meaning, nodes in a network of cosmic vibration that stretched across dimensions and epochs. And he could see the truth of what the threshold was. It wasn't a gate to another world. It wasn't a portal to the divine. It was a filter, a spiritual sieve designed to separate the light from the heavy, the empty from the full, the worthy from the wanting. And on the other side of that filter, waiting in the spaces that the frequency revealed, were things that made the Girtablilu seem as harmless as household pets. Cole saw them. He saw the things that the threshold kept out. He saw the hunger that waited beyond the gate, the cosmic predation that would consume the world if the filter ever failed. He saw why the guardians were necessary, why the garden was necessary, why every horror they had experienced was actually a mercy compared to what would happen if the threshold fell. And he understood, with a clarity that transcended human comprehension, that the tablets were not the prize. The tablets were the bait. They were the honey jar that attracted the flies, the shiny object that drew the greedy and the curious into the trap of the threshold. Meridian hadn't hired them to retrieve knowledge. Meridian had hired them to feed the filter. They were sacrifices, unknowing offerings to a system that needed periodic infusions of human consciousness to maintain its function. The realization should have broken him. It should have destroyed whatever remained of his hope, his purpose, his sense of meaning. But instead, it did something unexpected. It freed him. Because if the tablets were bait, then retrieving them was not success but complicity. And if he refused the bait, if he rejected the mission that had been designed to destroy him, then he was no longer playing the threshold's game. He was no longer a willing participant in his own sacrifice. He reached for the tablets in the frequency space, but instead of grasping them, he pushed them away. He rejected them. He denied them. And in that rejection, in that refusal to play the role that had been assigned to him, he felt something shift in the fabric of the threshold. The gate was not designed for rejection. It was designed for passage or failure, for success or curation, for emptiness or heaviness. It had no protocol for refusal, no mechanism for someone who simply said no. And in that absence of protocol, in that gap between categories, Cole found his escape. He fell backward through the gate, tumbling out of the frequency space and into the physical world with a force that drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping on the polished stone floor of the inner chamber. The Girtablilu were gone. The gate was gone. Tanaka was gone. Only Vane remained, standing over him with an expression of something that might have been surprise. "You came back," Vane said. "I rejected the tablets," Cole gasped, his chest heaving. "I rejected the mission. I rejected everything. And the threshold, it didn't know what to do with me. It couldn't process refusal, so it spit me out." "That is," Vane paused, his black eyes narrowing. "That is unprecedented. The threshold has operated for millennia. No one has ever refused the gate. No one has ever chosen neither passage nor curation." "There's a first time for everything," Cole said, pushing himself to his feet. His legs were unsteady, his vision blurred, but he was alive. He was whole. He was free. "Where are the others? Where's Tanaka?" "The sleeping one was taken by the guardians. She will be preserved until she is light enough to pass or heavy enough to curate. The others," Vane gestured toward the chamber's exit, where daylight was filtering in from the desert above. "The corporal and the geophysicist are beyond saving, but the medic she passed through cleanly. She is on the other side, safe, changed but safe." "And you?" "I remain as I have always remained. The threshold needs its witnesses, its interpreters, its sealers' veins." "Then goodbye," Cole said, "and thank you for whatever you did, for whatever you tried to do." He walked toward the exit, his steps unsteady but determined, and Vane didn't try to stop him. The sensory consultant simply watched, his black eyes unreadable, his form slowly fading into the shadows as if he was becoming part of the stone itself. The passage out of the inner chamber was shorter than the passage in had been. The maze of shifting geometry somehow resolved into a single straight corridor that led directly to the desert sunlight. Cole emerged blinking into the harsh brightness, his lungs filling with air that tasted of sand and heat and life, and he felt tears streaming down his face before he realized he was crying. The helicopter was gone, of course. The Rub al Khali stretched around him in an infinite expanse of dunes and sky, and he was alone in the largest sand desert on Earth with no water, no food, no navigation equipment, and no hope of rescue. But he was alive. He was free. And he carried in his mind a truth that was more valuable than any obsidian tablet, the knowledge of what waited beyond the threshold, and the determination to make sure that no one else ever stumbled into its trap. He began to walk, one foot in front of the other, heading toward where he thought the nearest settlement might be, or where it might have been before the threshold distorted his sense of direction. The sun beat down on him, and his tongue swelled with thirst, and his skin blistered and peeled under the relentless radiation. But he kept walking, because walking was what he did, because stopping meant death, and death meant the possibility of encountering the threshold again in whatever afterlife awaited beyond the veil. He didn't know how long he walked. Hours, days. Time lost meaning in the desert, became as fluid and deceptive as the heat shimmer that rose from the sand. He hallucinated, saw Girtablilu in every shadow, heard clicking in every breeze, felt the weight of the gaze upon him in every moment of solitude. But the hallucinations faded, as hallucinations do, and eventually he found himself stumbling into the outskirts of a village that he didn't recognize, collapsing into the shade of a palm tree, while children ran to fetch water and adults shouted in a language he didn't understand. He survived. That was the miracle of it. He survived dehydration, sunstroke, infection, and the slow psychological unraveling that came from carrying a truth too heavy for any single mind. He was found by Bedouin traders who treated his wounds and gave him water, and listened without understanding to his ravings about scorpion men and cosmic vibrations and gardens of the living dead. They delivered him to a coastal city, and from there he made his way back to civilization, back to the world of telephones and newspapers and human beings who had never seen the things he had seen. He reported to Meridian, of course. He told them everything, the Girtablilu, the garden, the gate, the truth about the tablets. He expected them to kill him, to silence him, to make him disappear in the way that corporations made inconvenient truths disappear. But Meridian didn't kill him. They simply didn't believe him. They wrote him off as a traumatized veteran suffering from PTSD-induced hallucinations, paid him his fee plus a substantial bonus for mental hardship, and sent him on his way with a non-disclosure agreement and a recommendation for psychiatric care. He didn't sign the agreement. He didn't seek psychiatric care. He simply disappeared, moving from city to city, country to country, carrying his truth like a burning coal in his chest. He told anyone who would listen, journalists, academics, conspiracy theorists, random strangers in bars, and he watched their eyes glaze over, watched them dismiss him as mad, watched them back away from the intensity of his conviction. And slowly, gradually, he learned to be silent, not because he had changed his mind, but because he understood that some truths were too heavy for the world to bear. He settled eventually in a small town on the coast of Spain, where the sound of the ocean masked the clicking that he still heard in quiet moments. He worked as a fisherman, rising before dawn to cast his nets into waters that were deep and dark and full of creatures that were monstrous by human standards but comforting in their normalcy. He lived alone, ate simply, slept poorly, and every night in the hours between midnight and dawn, he sat in silence and listened. He listened for the frequency, the cosmic vibration that had permeated his being in the chamber beyond the gate. It was fainter now, attenuated by distance and time, and the stubborn resistance of the human mind to things it couldn't comprehend. But it was still there, a hum beneath the threshold of hearing, a pressure against his eardrums, a reminder that the world was larger and stranger and hungrier than any of his neighbors suspected. And in the absolute silence of the Spanish nights, when even the ocean had fallen still and the wind had ceased its blowing, Cole heard something else. Something that hadn't been there before the expedition, something that had followed him back from the threshold like a predator tracking wounded prey. It was the sound of chitin clicking against stone. The sound of massive bodies moving with terrible grace through spaces that shouldn't exist. The sound of the Girtablilu, watching him from dimensions adjacent to his own, evaluating him still, judging him still, waiting for the moment when his guard dropped and his emptiness failed, and the weight of his heart became too much to bear. He knew, with a certainty that transcended rational proof, that the guardians had not forgotten him. The gate had spit him out, yes. He had refused the threshold's terms, had found a loophole in a system that had operated flawlessly for millennia. but loopholes can be closed. Systems can be updated, and the Girtablilu were patient in ways that human beings couldn't comprehend. They had been waiting since before the dawn of civilization. They could wait a little longer for one stubborn soldier who had cheated their master's filter. He heard them in the silence. He smelled them in the wind that carried the scent of distant deserts. He felt their gaze upon him in moments of solitude, the weight of their attention pressing against his skull like a physical force. And he understood with the clarity of a man who has faced absolute truth and survived, that his escape had not been final. It had merely been delayed. The threshold of Mashu had marked him. The Girtablilu knew his soul's taste now, knew its particular flavor of responsibility and guilt and desperate, futile love. They were waiting. They were always waiting. And someday, when the silence grew too deep and the night grew too dark and his defenses grew too thin, they would come for him. Not through the gate, but through the cracks in reality that the frequency opened. Not with stinger and gaze, but with the slow, patient erosion of sanity that came from knowing you were hunted by something that had all the time in the world. Cole sat on the beach as dawn broke over the Mediterranean, the sky bleeding from black to purple to gold, and he placed his hand against his chest. His heart was still beating. His lungs were still breathing. He was still alive, still free, still human in ways that the threshold couldn't comprehend and the guardians couldn't process. But he was also marked, also hunted, also waiting for the moment when the balance finally tipped and the scorpion men came to claim their due. The frequency hummed in his bones, a subsonic vibration that was part of him now, that would be part of him until the day he died. And in that vibration, in that cosmic resonance that connected him to the threshold across impossible distances, he heard the clicking, the endless, patient clicking of chitin against stone. They were coming. Not today, perhaps, not tomorrow, but someday. And when they came, Cole would face them with the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had carried him through a lifetime of war and horror and impossible choices. He would not be curated. He would not be devoured. He would find another loophole, another gap in the protocol, another way to survive. Because that was what Sergeant Darius Cole did. He survived. He endured. He carried the weight and kept walking, one foot in front of the other, through deserts and darkness and the endless, patient waiting of things that should not exist but did. The sun rose higher, burning away the last shadows of the night, and Cole rose from the sand to begin his day's work. The nets needed mending, the boat needed preparing, the fish needed catching, and somewhere in the spaces between the rising sun and the turning earth, the Girtablilu continued their vigil. The threshold must remain pure, the guardians serve, the gaze of the gate is eternal. And Sergeant Darius Cole, the man who had cheated the filter, who had refused the gate, who had walked away from the cosmic vibration with his soul intact, and his sanity frayed, went about his ordinary day in the ordinary world, carrying his extraordinary burden with the quiet, stubborn grace of a man who had learned that survival was not the absence of horror, but the persistence of self in spite of it. The clicking faded as the day grew bright, but it never disappeared entirely. It was always there, beneath the surface of things, patient and eternal, waiting for the silence to return. And Cole knew, with a certainty that was heavier than any cosmic truth, that when the silence finally came for him, he would be ready. Not because he was empty, not because he was light, but because he was full and heavy and absolutely, defiantly, stubbornly alive. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.